Hi guys. Tonight we are going to slip back into a world that smells of wood smoke, horse sweat, and candle wax, where the clank of armor echoes down stone corridors, and a boy's wildest dream is to become a knight. You picture yourself standing outside the weather-darkened walls of a castle, heart pounding, eyes wide, hoping someone inside will one day hand you a sword and call you worthy. The trouble is, you probably won't survive this path. That sounds dramatic, but it's true. Knighthood is expensive, brutal, and sometimes heartbreakingly out of reach. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love it if you posted your location and your local time down below. I'm always amazed at the thought of us all listening together across continents. Now, dim the lights, and let's begin. You trudge through muddy roads in your mind, gazing up at battlements where armored figures ride past on destriers. Their metal glitters in sunlight. Villagers gape as if saints were crossing the marketplace. For a child, it feels like staring at living legends. That is the dream of knighthood, something larger than life, draped in banners and riddled with stories. Yet when you blink, you remember that beneath the shining armor, there's a man with aching shoulders, debts he can't pay, and perhaps an unfortunate limp from a tournament gone wrong. One widely accepted fact is that the medieval world treated knighthood as the highest mark of status outside royalty itself. Knights were landholders, military elite, and social symbols, all rolled into one. That gave the image immense allure, a magnetic pull on anyone who saw the shimmer of steel crossing the horizon. Children in villages might swing sticks at one another, shouting "Sir something" with pretend bravado. You can almost hear their laughter now, muffled behind the clatter of carts and the bleating of sheep. But the path to that dream was thorny. You imagine yourself as a younger child, maybe clutching a piece of bread hard as stone, staring longingly at the Lord's Hall. If you were not born to a noble family, the odds were slim. Nobility controlled the gates, and a boy of peasant stock might wait a lifetime and still never touch a real sword. And yet, quirky exceptions existed. Legends tell of squires of no famous name who rose on courage alone, knighted on the battlefield when valor could not be ignored. These are the stories whispered around hearth fires, fueling hope that fate might bend the rules for you. As you drift along this memory landscape, think of the contradictions. Knights were meant to embody piety and chivalry, but everyone knew they could also be arrogant, violent, or too fond of gambling. This duality made the dream complicated. To be a knight was to step into a paradox, torn between lofty ideals and the grim reality of war. The very word chivalry promised gentleness, yet the mud-spattered clash of swords suggested otherwise. Historians still argue whether the culture of knighthood was more about real battlefield necessity or about carefully manufactured theatre designed to dazzle the masses. Close your eyes a little and picture the sensory overload, the clink of chainmail as it slides across a soldier's chest, the sour reek of boiled leather, the booming horns summoning men to muster at dawn. Every detail would brand itself into your imagination. Even the dream itself had a smell. Smoky torches, melted tallow, and that sharp tang of iron. Becoming a knight wasn't only about wielding a sword, it was about immersing yourself in this symphony of sound and scent, a constant reminder that honor came wrapped in discomfort. And in this drowsy, reflective moment, you sense how alluring it still feels. Despite the bruises and the debts, despite the danger and hypocrisy, the knight represents the unreachable ideal, someone riding just a little taller, bathed in admiration, sworn to causes greater than themselves. You can almost feel the weight of a lance in your hands, its tip trembling as you imagine charging down a list, wind tearing past your ears, crowd roaring around you. The dream still glows, centuries later, because it speaks to something primal, the hunger for recognition, the urge to belong to legend. So as you lie back and let the day ease away, remember, the journey to knighthood always began here, with the spark of longing, with the quiet conviction that maybe, just maybe, Your name could echo through halls after you are gone. That is the dream of knighthood, and it waits patiently at the edge of your imagination, shimmering like candlelight before sleep. You stand there with the dream shimmering in your chest, and then reality whispers, "Not everyone can play this game." The path narrows fast. Imagine yourself glancing around a medieval hall, where noble sons tumble across rush-strewn floors, wrestling with wooden practice swords. Their fathers are lords, their mothers wear rings heavy enough to bend your fingers, and the family crest already promises entry into the shining ranks of knighthood. If you're born into that circle, doors swing open almost without a knock. If not, well, you might as well try climbing the castle wall with your bare hands. That's the sharp truth. Lineage mattered. Being of noble birth wasn't just an advantage, it was often the ticket. A knight wasn't only a warrior, but also a man tied to land, vassalage, and wealth. Without property to fund horses, armor, and retainers, the whole enterprise collapsed. So the system tilted heavily toward those already cushioned by inheritance. One mainstream fact that grounds us here is simple. Medieval society legally defined knight as a rank within the nobility, not just a job you picked up on the battlefield. That meant the blood in your veins carried as much weight as the muscles in your arms. But quirks always crept in through the cracks. Sometimes a lord spotted a promising boy from humbler stock, a servant's son, perhaps who showed unusual skill or loyalty. With a stroke of fortune, that boy might be taken into service, trained as a page, and nudged along the path normally reserved for those with pedigrees. There's even a curious anecdote about William Marshall, later celebrated as one of England's greatest knights, who started life as the younger son of a minor noble family, so poor his father once handed him over as a hostage. He was in essence disposable, and yet by grit and charm he climbed higher than almost anyone, ending as regent of the realm. His story was the medieval version of a lottery ticket, proof that the rigid system occasionally bent. Still, most of the time you'd feel the weight of exclusion. You picture yourself waiting outside a training yard, listening to the thwack of wooden swords and the laughter of boys destined for armor. You clutch your own stick, pretending it's a blade, but you know nobody inside is calling your name. It's a bitter taste, half envy, half longing. And this is where debate swirls among scholars. Some argue knighthood was so tightly wrapped around noble privilege that the occasional low-born knight is more legend than reality. Others insist battlefields, especially during chaotic wars, produced plenty of moments when a commander, desperate for bravery, dubbed a man knight regardless of his background. You drift between these views, rocking gently like a boat on uncertain waters. Consider the economic side too. Even if you were born noble, you might still struggle. Younger sons often inherited nothing, their elder brothers absorbing the estate. For them, knighthood was both escape and burden. A chance at prestige, yes, but also a guarantee of financial strain. You can almost hear their muttered complaints: armor eating up coin faster than rents came in, war horses demanding more oats than peasants could grow. If you were unlucky, your noble title became a gilded cage. So what does all this feel like to you? It feels like standing in a long medieval line, watching gatekeepers check names against scrolls. If your family crest gleams on the parchment, you stride through head high. If not, you linger in the shadows, hoping chance or chaos will smudge the ink. That precarious dance between privilege and opportunity, heritage and happenstance defines the early stage of knighthood. And as you drift further into this half-dream, you realize that even the knights themselves, with all their pomp, often lived precariously. Birth gave them a start, but it didn't promise survival. A single lost battle, a ransom unpaid, or an ill-timed quarrel with the wrong lord could undo generations of pride. In that sense, everyone was climbing together, noble or not, some starting higher on the ladder, some clinging to the bottom rung, all praying the wood wouldn't snap beneath them. That is the truth of noble birth or lucky chance, the role of medieval dice, the cruel lottery that decided whether you donned shining mail or kept your head bowed in the dirt. And somewhere in that uncertain lottery, you place yourself, eyes shut, listening for the faint echo of hooves that might one day carry you forward. You're small now, maybe 7 or 8 years old, tugging at a tunic that hangs too long, your hair still wild from chasing geese in the yard. Suddenly, you're whisked away to a noble household, not to fight, not yet, but to serve. This is the first step on the winding staircase toward knighthood, becoming a page. It sounds impressive, doesn't it? In reality, it means a lot of fetching, carrying, and listening more than speaking. You scrub floors, polish boots, run messages between kitchens and chambers, and learn how to stand silently at the edge of feasts while meat bones and laughter fly across the tables. The mainstream historical fact here is that most noble boys began their martial education around age 7 as pages in another lord's household, not their father's. This wasn't just about training. It was about forming bonds between families, weaving together a net of loyalty and obligation that might hold firm later in war or politics. So you, the page, aren't only learning to hold a tray or saddle a pony, you're becoming a living piece in the chess game of medieval society. Yet daily life wasn't all solemn duty. The quirky side of being a page shows up in little details. You might be expected to memorize verses of poetry, practice playing a lute, or learn to dance in the awkward shuffle of the time. One chronicler even joked that a good page was half servant, half jester. That's right, between sweeping ashes and serving wine, you might be called on to amuse the household with silly tricks or clumsy rhymes. Imagine yourself, cheeks red, stumbling through a rhyme about a lady's hair, while knights in the hall chuckle into their goblets. Humiliating, maybe, but training all the same, teaching you poise, resilience, and the ability to hide embarrassment behind a smile. The lessons seeped in quietly. You're told how to clean your lord's sword without nicking the blade, how to carry a shield without dropping it on your toes, how to address guests with respect. You watch knights swagger past, their spurs clinking, and you memorize every move. When they laugh, you wonder if you'll ever laugh that way, full of confidence and command. When they kneel before a priest, you feel the weight of devotion pressing into your young bones. The world of knighthood is here, all around you, but still out of reach, shimmering like a mirage. And here's where the scholars bicker. Some insist that the page years were mostly about discipline and social polish, preparing boys for leadership in peacetime just as much as battle. Others argue the martial side was emphasized from the very start. Pages learned to wrestle, hunt, and handle small weapons almost immediately. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. You, meanwhile, are simply tired. Your hands ache from polishing armor. Your stomach rumbles when you carry roast venison past your nose to place it before a lord. You dream of sneaking scraps but know the punishment if caught. Yet there's a rhythm, almost comforting to this stage. Wake with the servants, light fires, muck out stables, listen to priests chanting in the chapel. The scents linger in your memory. Damp rushes on the floor, beeswax candles dripping down wooden holders, sweat from knights returning after hunting boar. And sometimes rarely you're rewarded with a kind word, a pat on the shoulder, a whisper that you've done well. Those tiny sparks keep the dream alive, glowing faintly as you fall asleep on a straw mattress at night. Occasionally, you're even drawn into the stories of the court. Maybe you carry a message to a lady, blush when she thanks you, and later boast to your fellow pages about the glance she gave. Or you witness knights grumbling about taxes, their voices low but their words sharp, giving you a child's eye view of politics you barely understand. Everything around you becomes an education, though not the kind spelled out in books. So, as you drift through these early years, you begin to sense the strange mix of servitude and preparation. You are nobody, yet you are training to be somebody. You fetch and carry, yet in every polished boot, every respectful bow, every whispered poem, you're learning the script you'll need to perform if fortune smiles. And when you finally crawl onto your pallet of straw, you dream of the armor you'll one day wear, the battles you'll one day fight, the feasts where you'll sit at the table instead of hovering behind it. That is the childhood of a page, exhausting, humbling, sometimes humiliating, yet full of hidden seeds that might one day sprout into the steel-clad form of a knight. You roll onto your side, eyes heavy, feeling the echoes of clattering dishes and hushed chapel prayers as they settle into your dreams. You've grown taller now, your legs stronger, your shoulders broadening from years of chores and mock practice. One morning, a gruff steward tosses you a bridle and points toward the stable. This is where your next ordeal begins, learning to master the horse. To be a knight without knowing how to ride would be like trying to be a sailor who can't swim. You stumble at first, fumbling with straps and buckles, the animal's hot breath fogging in the morning air, and you wonder how on earth this creature is supposed to become your partner in battle. The straightforward historical fact is that horsemanship sat at the very heart of knighthood. The very word chivalry comes from the old French chivalry, rooted in cheval, meaning horse. Knights weren't simply men with swords, they were defined by their ability to fight on horseback. Without a war horse, you were just another infantryman, and nobody sang songs about those. But here's the quirky bit. Young squires often began their equestrian lessons on mules or ponies, not the mighty destriers painted in romantic tales. Imagine your disappointment when you're told to practice balance and reins on a shaggy little animal more stubborn than majestic. And still, these sessions were essential. You learned to grip with your knees, to lean with the animal's rhythm, to guide with the lightest of pulls. You probably fell a lot. You hit the dirt, the wind knocked out of you, your tunic coated in mud. Stable boys laughed, and knights shook their heads. Getting back up was part of the training, bruises and all. The sensations are vivid. The leather reins bite into your palms. The animal's smell, half hay, half manure, clings to your clothes. Your thighs burn as you cling for dear life. And every time you tumble, you swear you'll never climb back on, until pride forces you to try again. Slowly, painfully, something clicks. You begin to feel that subtle conversation between rider and horse, that give and take where your weight shifts and the animal responds. It's like learning a new language, one spoken with legs, hands, and breath. Historians continue to debate just how formalized this horse training was. Some argue noble boys received careful, almost scientific instruction in riding schools. Others think it was rougher, more improvisational. Throw the lad on and let him figure it out. Either way, you know the bruises are real, and the stakes even more so. Because if you cannot keep your seat in the saddle, you cannot hope to charge into battle with lance lowered and survive. You also glimpse the economic side again. A proper war horse cost a fortune. Feeding, grooming, stabling, all of it devoured silver. Lords sometimes presented squires with lesser mounts for practice, while reserving the great chargers for seasoned warriors. If you dreamed of one day astride such a beast, you also dreamed of coin enough to keep it fed. Horses were, in many ways, the engines of knighthood, and without one, the gleaming armor and noble title rang hollow. But in your sleepy imagination, you sense the thrill too. You picture yourself riding at dawn, mist curling along a meadow, hooves drumming like distant thunder. You lean low, trusting your mount to carry you forward, the world blurring in speed. For a moment, you and the horse are one creature, breath and muscle fused, and you understand why knights so often spoke of their steeds as brothers in arms. That's the training in horsemanship. Humiliating at first, expensive always, but ultimately magical when it works. You shift on your straw mattress tonight with sore legs and aching pride, but behind your closed eyelids gallops the image of a great horse carrying you to glory. And you realize that without this step, the shining path to knighthood will never truly open. Your body has barely recovered from the jolts of horsemanship before another challenge looms. The practice yard smells of dust and sweat, wooden posts jammed into the ground, straw-stuffed dummies swinging lazily from ropes. This is where you meet your first real opponents, not enemy soldiers, but splintering practice weapons that seem determined to bruise every inch of your skin. You pick up a wooden sword, heavier than you expected, its balance strange, and you brace yourself. Today is about weapon drills, and yes, about bruises that make you wince long after the day is done. The firm historical fact here is that young squires learned their martial skills with wooden or blunted weapons long before touching steel. It was practical. You could swing hard without killing your sparring partner. Training emphasized repetition strikes, parries, thrusts, again and again until the motions lived in your muscles. Hours blurred together, the rhythm as mind-numbing as it was necessary. You swung at posts until your arms trembled, then you swung some more. Of course, there's always a peculiar detail that sneaks into this picture. Some squires tied stones to their practice swords to make them heavier, believing that if they could manage the burden in training, a real sword would feel almost weightless in battle. The result? Exaggerated bruises, and the occasional broken toe when a weapon slipped from a sweating hand. You imagine yourself hobbling back to the dormitory, muttering curses under your breath, then trying to hide the limp when the knight you serve strides by. Sensory impressions flood in. The wood smacks against shields with a hollow thunk. Splinters prick your palms. Sweat drips into your eyes, stinging. Your shoulders scream, your knuckles throb, and yet some stubborn streak keeps you standing in the ring, battered but unwilling to quit. Every bruise is a lesson, every welt a silent medal. You exchange glances with other squires, half grimaces, half grins, because you know you're all enduring the same painful initiation. And yet scholars disagree about just how effective this kind of training was. Some argue it prepared young men remarkably well, that the ceaseless drills forged lightning reflexes. Others insist it was crude, even dangerous, producing bad habits that only real combat could correct. The truth may lie in the uneasy space between. You learned enough to survive, but never enough to feel truly ready when sharp steel finally flashed. Still, alongside the bruises, there's exhilaration. When your strike lands just right, when the wooden blade connects with the dummy's shield edge and the sound rings out crisp and sharp, a little surge of pride fills you. For a heartbeat, you feel the promise of knighthood not as a dream, but as something you could actually hold in your aching hands. At night, your body is sore, but your mind is alive. You picture battles yet to come, tournaments where crowds cheer as you lower a lance, duels where honor hangs on a single parry. These imaginings soften the pain. They make the bruises almost feel like badges. And so, with a wince, you roll onto your straw pallet, bruises blooming like dark flowers, drifting towards sleep while the thump of wooden swords echoes in your dreams. That is weapon training, tedious, punishing, oddly exhilarating. It teaches you that pain is not an obstacle but a constant companion, and only by welcoming it can you edge closer to the title of knight. You limp out of the training yard, shoulders aching, palms raw, only to be told there's another duty on your path. This one doesn't involve bruises, at least not to the body. Instead, it marks the bruising of pride. You're summoned to the chapel. The air is cool, thick with incense, the flicker of candles dancing against stone walls. Here the church waits to shape you not with swords but with vows, prayers, and the weight of God's approval. The plain historical fact is that knighthood was never only a military title, it was infused with religion. From the 12th century onward, priests often blessed young men at ceremonies, draping them in white garments symbolizing purity, sprinkling them with holy water, and reminding them that their swords were not merely tools of war, but symbols of divine justice. The knight's oath was meant to serve both earthly lord and heavenly lord. You feel the gravity of that when the priest looks into your eyes and intones words that sound like commands from heaven itself. Of course, religion in daily training had its oddities. One quirky detail recorded in chronicles tells of squires being expected to spend an entire night before their dubbing vigil in prayer, kneeling or standing without sleep. In practice, many dozed off, heads bobbing, trying to look pious even as exhaustion dragged them under. You imagine yourself there, candlelight flickering, knees screaming in pain, eyelids drooping, only to jerk awake when the priest coughs suspiciously. half devotion, half sheer endurance. The chapel is full of sensations that feel so different from the practice yard. Instead of sweat and dust, you smell frankincense and beeswax. Instead of bruises, you feel the sting of humility as you bow and cross yourself. Yet here, too, the discipline cuts deep. You're reminded that a knight isn't free to chase personal glory alone. You're bound to ideals bigger than yourself. Mercy, protection of the weak, defense of the church, all wrapped around you like a cloak, even if reality doesn't always live up to the words. Historians debate the sincerity of this religious role. Some say knights genuinely internalized their spiritual duties, shaping Europe's wars and politics through devotion. Others argue it was propaganda, crafted by clerics to tame a violent warrior class by dressing them in holy robes. Perhaps both are true faith mingling with convenience, prayer mixing with ambition. You feel the tension in your own chest, one part inspired, another part skeptical, as though you know full well that some knights mutter prayers in chapel, only to raid villages by dusk. Still, there's something calming here. The chant of monks seeps into your ears like a lullaby. The stained glass glows in shafts of colored light, washing over your face. You kneel, close your eyes, and feel a strange peace settle into your bones. Maybe this is what the church wanted all along, not perfection, but the attempt, however faltering, to link sword and soul. And when you rise from the chapel floor, muscles stiff, knees numb, you carry something invisible but undeniable. The sense that your path isn't only about strength, it's also about spirit, however imperfectly you manage it. That reminder lingers as you step out into the daylight, the smell of incense still clinging to your clothes, the echo of vows humming in your ears. That is the church's hand in your journey, gentle, heavy, sometimes hypocritical, sometimes deeply moving. You may doubt, but you cannot ignore it. And so, you walk back toward your duties, a little more solemn, a little more uncertain, and somehow, a little more determined. You're back in the castle yard again, no longer the tiny page scurrying underfoot, but not yet the armored figure you dream of. The in-between years have arrived, and with them comes a new identity, the squire. You trade serving wine goblets for carrying swords, sweeping floors for polishing chainmail until it gleams. Everyone reminds you that this stage is critical, your apprenticeship, your trial period, the years that will decide whether you truly have what it takes to earn knighthood. One point the chronicles agree upon is that a young man usually became a squire around the age of 14. From this moment, he shadowed a knight almost constantly. You imagine yourself trudging after your master, lugging a shield so heavy your back screams, or holding his horse steady while he adjusts his gauntlets. It's not glamorous. In fact, it feels like glorified servitude. Yet these duties, menial as they seem, are lessons disguised in sweat. By polishing mail links, you learn how armor fits. By tightening saddle straps, you understand the importance of balance. Every task is training in disguise. But the role of the squire had its stranger sides. Accounts tell us that squires often had to warm their lord's bed in winter by lying in it first, a duty not nearly as noble as wielding a sword. Some were ordered to carry chamber pots, others to run errands through town at ungodly hours, still others to stand guard outside doors all night while their knight feasted inside. You picture yourself yawning in a drafty corridor, listening to laughter and clinking goblets through oak doors, your stomach empty and your feet numb. There's something almost comical about the contrast. One day, you're expected to defend the realm. Today, you're scrubbing mud from boots. Still, this was apprenticeship at its most immersive. You learned by proximity, absorbing skills like a sponge soaking up spilled wine. You saw how knights greeted lords, how they bowed to ladies, how they tightened helmets before a joust. Every gesture was a rehearsal for your future. You practice swordplay more seriously now, with steel blades under watchful eyes. You drilled with lances, sometimes aiming at the quintain, a rotating arm with a shield on one side and a weighted bag on the other. Miss the shield, and the bag whacked you squarely in the back. It was humiliating, bruising, and effective. Contemporary historians are divided about just how much martial training squires truly received. Some argue they were almost full-fledged fighters by this stage, riding into combat with their lords and serving as backup. Others think many squires were kept mostly on chores, seeing real battle only rarely until formally knighted. The evidence doesn't settle neatly. You're left with two possibilities. Either you gained crucial combat experience young, or you endured endless drudgery and waited impatiently for the real test. Either way, the path wound forward. The sensory world of a squire was intense. Imagine the metallic tang of polish on your fingers after hours cleaning mail, the clatter of hooves as you jog beside your knight's destrier, lungs burning to keep up, the sting of sweat running into your eyes while you adjust a cumbersome helm. You may even sneak a sip of the wine you're delivering, hoping nobody notices. Little acts of rebellion colored the monotony, because honestly, how long can anyone endure without a bit of mischief? Squires were also expected to join their knights at tournaments. You might hold spare weapons at the edge of the field, or drag your battered master away when he fell. If you were lucky, he let you enter minor contests, facing other squires in mock battles. The crowd didn't cheer as loudly for you, but your heart raced all the same. One misplaced step, one poorly timed swing, and you were sprawled in the dirt, ears ringing, pride dented. And yet, these little defeats were necessary. They taught resilience, persistence, the art of grinning through embarrassment. Oddly enough, squires also learned a softer side of knightly life. They were instructed in courtly manners how to carve meat at a feast, how to bow correctly, how to compliment a lady's gown without sounding like a fool. You picture yourself stammering through a greeting, cheeks hot, while your fellow squires snicker from behind the benches. Failure here stung almost as much as a bruised rib. But knights were expected to be more than warriors. They were social ornaments, performing grace in banquet halls as much as valor on battlefields. And through all of this, you kept waiting for recognition. Every task you completed, every hour of training, felt like placing a coin in a jar. One day, when the jar was full, you hoped the reward would arrive. The dubbing, the sword, the title. Until then you endured. You gritted your teeth as you polished another breastplate, as you held another horse steady, as you fetched yet another jug of water. You told yourself that this grind was the forge, and you were the blade. The reality, of course, was harsher. Not every squire made it. Some died in battle before receiving their accolade. Others fell from favour, dismissed for incompetence or insolence. A few simply faded back into obscurity, their years of service never rewarded. You couldn't be sure which fate awaited you. That uncertainty gnawed at you at night, when you lay on straw staring into the dark. Was all this labour leading somewhere, or would it dissolve like smoke? Yet there was one undeniable comfort. You weren't alone. Squires formed their own camaraderie, bound by shared bruises, whispered jokes, and stolen bites of food. You laughed together when a fellow tripped over a shield strap. You covered for one another when a flask went missing from the wine cellar. These friendships gave the role its heart, turning endless drudgery into something bearable. So as you drift deeper into the life of a squire, you feel the tension between menial chores and noble ambition. Every day humbles you, yet every day teaches you. You balance shame with pride, servitude with hope. You remind yourself that each bruise, each sleepless vigil, each polished helm is another step toward the elusive dream of knighthood. That is the life of the squire, half servant, half apprentice, caught between mud and glory. You close your eyes tonight and hear the clink of spurs that aren't yours yet, the echo of footsteps you still follow, and the faint promise that one day you'll walk in front. You trail behind your knight as the sun sinks low, shadows stretching across fields. The air tastes of ash and churned earth. You smell smoke long before you see the camp, the haze of burning huts drifting across the horizon. This is no practice yard, no courtly banquet. Tonight, you've arrived at the threshold of your first real battle. The weight of that realization presses on your chest harder, perhaps, than the shield strapped to your arm. One detail no chronicler disputes is that squires often accompanied their knights into combat, though usually in supporting roles. You weren't expected to ride at the front just yet, but you were expected to be there, to bring spare weapons, to tend to injuries, to drag your knight out of danger if he fell. It was dangerous enough. Many young men found themselves caught in the chaos, clinging desperately to survival while trying not to disgrace themselves. You can imagine your pulse hammering in your ears as you clutch a spare lance, praying you won't be noticed by the enemy. Still, scattered anecdotes reveal curious glimpses of how unready squires often were. One tale tells of a boy so nervous on his first campaign that he mounted his horse backward, earning the mocking nickname Sir Back to Front for years afterward. Others froze at the first clash of steel, hiding behind wagons until dragged into the fray. You feel sympathy for them. The gulf between practice drills and actual combat yawns wider than anyone admits. The first thing you notice is the noise. War is deafening. The crash of metal on metal, the screams of men and horses, the blare of horns it surrounds you. A storm of sound so overwhelming that your thoughts scatter like leaves in wind. The second thing you notice is the smell. Sweat, smoke, hot iron, and beneath it all, the coppery tang of blood. You stumble forward, senses overloaded, and wonder if anyone can ever be truly prepared for this. Modern historians still disagree about the extent to which young squires were allowed or forced into the thick of battle. Some argue they were deliberately kept back, shielded until their knighting. Others point to chronicles describing teenage squires performing heroic deeds, sometimes even knighted on the spot for bravery under fire. The truth may depend on circumstance. A cautious lord might keep his squires at camp. A desperate commander might throw every able body into the melee. And so you stand in that liminal space, unsure whether you'll spend this battle carrying water or crossing swords. And then, suddenly, your knight calls. You rush forward, hand him a fresh lance as his splinters against an opponent's shield. You back away quickly, heart racing, hoping not to trip under the hooves thundering past. A horse crashes down nearby, rider screaming, and you flinch as mud and blood spatter across your tunic. There's no time to think. You're caught in a current stronger than any river, swept along whether you will it or not. The physical strain is brutal. You run, stumble, heave equipment that weighs as much as you. Your breath tears at your throat. Your arms tremble. At one point you nearly collapse, but the fear of disgrace keeps your legs moving. Around you, the world narrows to fragments. The gleam of a sword blade, the guttural shout of an order, the terrified eye of a horse that rears too close. You realize that every bruise and every drill has led to this moment, and yet nothing could ever have prepared you for the chaos of real war. Oddly enough, battle also taught unexpected lessons. Some knights were said to test their squires' nerves by sending them into camp at night to guard the baggage train. It was here, away from the spotlight, that many boys proved their worth chasing off raiders, calming panicked horses, or holding the line when small skirmishes broke out. These unsung moments shaped courage as surely as the great charges did. You imagine yourself gripping a spear in the dark, every rustle sounding like an ambush, your mouth dry with fear but your stance firm. When dawn comes and the fighting ebbs, you're left with exhaustion so deep it feels like stone in your bones. You collapse onto the ground, mud soaking into your clothes, too tired even to eat. The knight you serve may or may not praise you. Praise is scarce currency. But deep inside, you know you've crossed a threshold. You've seen war's face, ugly and unrelenting, and you've survived. Some accounts insist that surviving a first campaign was almost a prerequisite for knighthood. It proved you could endure fear without breaking, that you could stand in the maelstrom and still function. Others downplay the battlefield's role, pointing instead to ceremonial training and noble lineage. Yet lying there, mud on your skin, your ears still ringing, you feel certain that this experience has changed you more than any lecture or feast ever could. You remember the absurd little details too, the way your boots filled with water when you stepped in a ditch, The way a fellow squire cracked an awful joke mid-battle just to stop himself from crying. The way your stomach growled embarrassingly loud during a lull in fighting. These human fragments anchor the memory, keeping it from dissolving into an abstract blur of swords and banners. As night falls again, you curl into a blanket that smells of smoke, your body trembling with fatigue. You've passed through fire, and though the road ahead is still long, you feel older, heavier, more certain of your path. The dream of knighthood is no longer just about shining armor or courtly songs. It's about endurance. It's about fear, faced and survived. That is your first taste of battle. Bewildering, brutal, unforgettable. You close your eyes, hearing echoes of clashing steel in your dreams, and wonder if you will ever see those shadows the same way again. The night after battle feels heavier than any armor. You lie awake under a starless sky, body aching, mind buzzing, and then, as if out of nowhere, you're summoned. This isn't a drill, not a lecture, not even another errand. It's the moment every squire dreams of, the moment whispered about in straw-filled dormitories, the ceremony of knighthood itself. You rise, knees trembling, wondering if you are ready. A well-recorded custom shows that the dubbing, or adubement, could take place in many contexts, sometimes in the solemn hush of a chapel, sometimes right on the battlefield after a courageous act, sometimes at a lord's court surrounded by banners and noble guests. You never knew when the moment might come. It was as unpredictable as it was momentous. Tonight, apparently, the time has arrived. Odd traditions coloured the event. One curious detail was the collet, a light blow, often a tap with the flat of a sword or even a slap on the cheek. It symbolized the last time you should accept a strike without defending yourself. Imagine standing there, heart pounding, when suddenly your lord gives you a sharp smack across the face. Not exactly the glamorous vision you carried as a boy polishing boots, but the sting, embarrassing as it was, stayed with you forever. The sensory details flood in as you picture the hall. Torches hiss against the walls, their smoke curling upward. The floor is cool beneath your knees as you kneel. You can smell the faint sweetness of beeswax candles mingling with the tang of metal from nearby weapons. A hush settles across the gathered crowd. Then your knight, or perhaps your lord, raises his sword and lowers it toward you. The flat blade brushes your shoulder, left, then right. The words fall heavy, promises of loyalty, honor, defense of the weak, service to God and sovereign. Some historians emphasize the religious intensity of these rituals, insisting that they were almost mini-ordinations, turning knights into warrior monks of sorts. Others downplay that, suggesting many dubbings were rushed, practical affairs barely more than a formal nod before battle resumed. The truth, as usual, seems to sit somewhere in the middle. You, kneeling there, don't have time to pass the debate. You only feel the weight of the moment, the sense that your life has pivoted on its axis. You rise slowly, awkwardly, your knees stiff, your new spurs glinting in the torchlight. You're handed a sword, its hilt wrapped in leather, heavier than any wooden blade you practiced with. The leather smells sharp, almost spicy, new and intimidating. This weapon is yours now, not borrowed, not handed back after practice, but bound to you by oath. The weight presses into your palm, a reminder that dreams have turned to responsibility. And there are human details too, ones not always captured in chronicles. Fellow squires might nudge each other, whispering jokes, mocking your red cheeks or shaky voice. Nobles in the audience might glance at one another, wondering if you'll live up to the promise. Somewhere in the shadows, a servant might roll their eyes, muttering that you still can't fasten your armor properly. The solemnity of the moment mingles with the ordinary humor of life, reminding you that no ritual ever erases humanity. Sometimes, the dubbing included new clothes, perhaps a white tunic for purity, a red robe for the blood you must be ready to spill, and a black cloak for the mortality awaiting you. The symbolism clung like a second skin. You could almost feel the future woven into the fabric. These garments whispered of triumph and doom in equal measure. Afterward came the feast. Tables groaned under roasted meats, bread still warm from ovens, and goblets brimming with spiced wine. You sat higher than you ever had before, no longer at the servants' end but among knights. The air was thick with laughter, song, and the occasional belch. You tried to eat without shaking, to drink without spilling, to smile without looking terrified. This was your welcome, your initiation into a brotherhood that stretched across Europe, woven of steel, blood, and vows. But inside, you knew it wasn't over. This was only the beginning. The tapping of the sword, the spurs strapped to your heels, the oaths mouthed in a smoky hall. These were symbols, not guarantees. The real test still lay ahead. Could you live the ideals you had sworn? Could you balance faith with ferocity, loyalty with survival, honor with the temptations of power? Your eyelids grow heavy now as the feast blurs. You feel the heat of the fire, hear the crack of logs collapsing into embers. Somewhere in the distance, a minstrel plucks at a lute, singing of heroes long past. You tilt your head back, half listening, half drifting, and realize you have joined the ranks of those very heroes, at least in name. That is the dubbing ceremony, part ritual, part theatre, part life, altering transformation. You lie down tonight not just as a servant, not just as an apprentice, but as a knight. And as your dreams gather, the memory of that sword's weight on your shoulder lingers, heavy and inescapable. The echoes of the dubbing ceremony still hum in your ears, but the next morning, reality hits you in the ribs. You are a knight now, at least by name, but being a knight is not only about vows and spurs, it's about equipment, and equipment costs coin, and coin is never enough. The dream, it turns out, has a heavy price tag. Contemporary accounts leave no doubt. Arming oneself as a knight was staggeringly expensive. A full suit of mail could take months of labor to craft and cost as much as a peasant family's farm. A properly bred warhorse, tall, muscular, trained to charge without flinching, was worth more than a small village. Add to that a lance, a sword, a dagger, a shield painted with your heraldry, and you begin to understand why only the wealthy, or those backed by wealthy patrons, could pursue this path. You feel your stomach knot as you calculate, realizing each piece of gear weighs as much on your purse as it does on your body. Yet the picture isn't only grim. There are odd details tucked in the margins of history. Some squires, unable to afford proper armor, practiced in stitched leather padded with horsehair, or even bundles of reeds. There are stories of men borrowing mismatched gear, one knight clanking into battle with greaves that belonged to 3 different owners, his shield painted hastily the night before with cheap dye. You imagine yourself holding a sword whose pommel is chipped, whose leather grip still smells faintly of its previous owner's sweat. Not exactly the shining image sung about in romances, but functional enough. The sensory reality of equipment is unforgettable. The mail shirt scratches at your neck and shoulders, its iron links pulling down until your muscles burn just from standing. The helmet narrows your vision, your breath condensing inside until it feels like you're suffocating. The sword, for all its glory, grows heavier with each swing, your wrists aching long before the fight is done. And then there's the horse, beautiful, yes, but demanding constant care, hay and oats devoured daily like a bottomless pit of expense. Owning such an animal feels like trying to keep gold coins alive by feeding them grain. Scholars still wrangle with the question of how knights afforded all this. Some insist most relied heavily on the revenues of land they held in fief, peasants' rents funding their gear. Others suggest many knights lived in perpetual debt, borrowing from moneylenders, pawning family heirlooms, or depending on their lords for handouts. The truth probably shifts depending on the knight. Some wealthy beyond imagining, others perpetually broke, their armor patched with hope more than steel. And of course, there's the maintenance. You don't simply buy armor once and forget it. Links snap, straps tear, blades dull. Every battle, every tournament, every rainy campaign leaves you with something broken. You imagine sitting late at night with a whetstone, dragging it along the sword edge, sparks flickering in the firelight. Your hands are blistered, Your back is sore, but if you don't keep the blade sharp, it might fail you when you need it most. Curiously, the cost of gear sometimes forced knights into creative arrangements. Some served wealthier lords in exchange for equipment. Others shared resources within families, passing down suits of mail from father to son, piece by piece. There's even mention of communal armories, where vassals could borrow what they needed for a campaign. You picture a room full of mismatched helmets, dented shields, and swords with edges chipped like teeth, a medieval lost and found that smelled of oil and rust. But no matter how patched, how worn, once you stepped into that harness of iron, you felt different. The clink of mail across your chest, the creak of leather straps, the solid heft of a sword in your fist, they turned you into something more than yourself. Heavier, slower, yes, but also larger than life. Villagers stared when you rode past in gleaming gear. Children pointed, mouths open, as if a storybook figure had trotted into their fields. And you, beneath the helmet, felt both pride and terror. Pride at finally appearing the part you had dreamed of for years. Terror at knowing that if you failed in battle, the very expense of your armor could become your coffin, because if you fell, enemies would strip it from your corpse and sell it before your body even cooled. So tonight, as you ease the armor off piece by piece, your muscles sigh in relief. You stack the sword carefully by your bedroll, shield propped nearby, horse tethered close. You know you must guard these things as fiercely as your own life, for without them you are no knight at all. That is the cost of equipment. Staggering, humbling, sometimes ruinous, but inseparable from the identity of knighthood. You drift into sleep with the faint rattle of mail still echoing in your ears, your dreams weighted down by iron and debt. The clink of armor fades into something softer now. Color, symbols, identity painted onto wood and fabric. For a knight, equipment alone isn't enough. You need a sign, a mark that tells the world who you are even when your face is hidden behind a visor. That is where heraldry steps in, turning shields and banners into something halfway between art and advertisement. One truth recorded in armorial rolls is that heraldry emerged in the 12th century precisely because armor concealed identity. In the chaos of battle, nobody could tell one mail-clad rider from another. So families painted shields with bright, simple designs, lions, crosses, stars, and stripes patterns visible at a distance. You imagine yourself staring at a freshly painted shield, the smell of pigment sharp in your nose, hoping that whatever design you chose will one day be recognized and feared. Of course, not every design was lofty. Odd stories survive of knights adopting strangely personal emblems: a goose, a pair of dice, even a frying pan. Some chroniclers mock these eccentric choices, but for the men who bore them, they carried meaning: private jokes, local pride, or reminders of family lore. You picture yourself nervously painting a wobbly star on your shield, only to have your fellow knights laugh and call it a chicken's footprint. It's embarrassing, yes, but it still distinguishes you from the faceless sea of iron. The sensory world of heraldry is bright and bold. Imagine workshops where painters grind pigments from minerals: azurite for deep blue, cinnabar for brilliant red, charcoal for stark black. The colors smear across wood, staining fingers, filling the room with the tang of oils and glue. Once dry, the shields gleam like stained glass in the sun, banners snapping overhead with every gust of wind. The battlefield becomes a moving tapestry, terrifying in scale, oddly beautiful in pattern. Modern experts debate how much heraldry was about true identification versus pure pageantry. Some argue it was essential military communication, helping lords see who was where in the field. Others suggest it quickly slid into vanity, each family competing to outshine the next, with elaborate coats of arms and poetic mottos. Either way, heraldry became inseparable from knighthood, as central as sword or spur. Carrying those symbols meant carrying reputation. When you rode into a village with your crest painted proudly, peasants whispered your name, perhaps in awe, perhaps in fear. At tournaments, heralds shouted out the blazon, a red field with 3 golden lions, as if announcing a celebrity. You picture yourself lifting your shield high, cheeks warming as strangers cheer or boo, your symbol fluttering like an announcement of who you are before you even lower your lance. But heraldry had its more tedious side too. The rules were bewildering: what colors could be placed on which metals, what shapes could combine without breaking tradition. Heralds themselves were professionals, memorizing hundreds of coats, policing who had the right to bear which designs. If you chose poorly or copied another's crest, you might be accused of usurpation. It was less about creativity, more about fitting into an evolving code. You, uncertain with your brush, probably wondered if your crooked lion would pass muster. There's a human comedy in it all. Imagine knights ribbing each other at feasts. Your dragon looks like a worm, my friend. Or drunkenly swapping shields, only to cause chaos when the herald calls the wrong name. Behind the pomp and ceremony, heraldry was also a source of humor, teasing, and occasional embarrassment. Still, the importance cannot be overstated. These designs outlasted lives. When a knight fell, his crest might be carved into his tomb, painted onto monastery walls, or stitched into stained glass. Long after the man was dust, his symbols glowed on banners, remembered in rolls of arms. That, in a way, was immortality. So, tonight, as you set your shield by your bed, you run a hand across the painted surface. The colors feel smooth under your fingertips, the lines imperfect but yours. You think of the generations to come, whether they will honor this symbol, laugh at it, or forget it entirely. For now, though, it gives you something no coin or sword can: identity, distinct and fragile, fluttering in the wind. That is heraldry, part battlefield necessity, part medieval fashion show, part promise of legacy. You drift into dreams of banners waving above your head, your colors glinting in torchlight, your name carried farther than your voice could ever reach. The paint on your shield has barely dried, your crest barely memorized by the heralds. When the next demand of knighthood weighs on you, not a weapon or a horse this time, but something far heavier, the code you're expected to live by. It's called chivalry, a word that sounds noble enough when whispered at feasts, but in practice is a slippery thing. Everyone talks about it, few seem to follow it consistently, and yet you cannot escape it. One reliable truth from medieval manuals is that the chivalric code blended military, religious, and social obligations. Knights were told to defend the church, protect the weak, serve their lord, and uphold honor. You imagine yourself standing in a dim hall while a priest or poet recites these lofty commandments, and you nod along, even as you wonder how on earth anyone manages to keep all of them at once. It's like being told to be fearless, humble, generous, fierce, and merciful all simultaneously, in every situation. Of course, the contradictions were obvious even then. Chronicles give us curious glimpses of knights swearing to show mercy to the poor, then turning around and raiding a peasant village for supplies the same week. Some knights fasted before tournaments to show devotion, only to gamble their winnings away after the feast. You can almost hear the muttered sarcasm among squires. So we're merciful, unless the rent is late? That tension between ideal and reality haunted knighthood like a shadow. The sensory texture of the code was as vivid as any armor. Imagine being handed a written set of knightly virtues, the ink smelling sharp, the parchment stiff under your fingers. The words glow in candlelight. Courage, loyalty, faith, humility. They look neat on the page, yet when you close your eyes you see yesterday's battlefield, mud-spattered and merciless, and you wonder how humility survives in the middle of charging horses. Modern scholars don't agree on how seriously these codes were followed. Some argue they were genuine moral compasses, shaping conduct both in war and in peace. Others suggest they were more like PR campaigns, crafted by poets and clerics to polish the image of a warrior class that otherwise seemed dangerously unruly. The reality, as always, might be a mix. Knights aspired to the ideals, failed often, but kept the language alive because it offered meaning, purpose, and, let's be honest, good publicity. And then there's the stranger side of chivalry, quirky vows and pledges that sound more like dares than moral duties. Knights swore to wear the same clothes until they achieved victory, or vowed not to sit down until they'd completed a quest. One knight famously promised not to wash his hands until he'd avenged an insult chivalry with a rather pungent twist. You picture yourself trying to keep a straight face while listening to such vows, praying you won't get stuck with a ridiculous one of your own. Despite the contradictions, the code served a purpose. It gave knights a story to tell about themselves, a role to play beyond raw violence. When villagers saw you ride by, they didn't just see an armed man. They were meant to see a protector, a model of virtue. Whether or not that was always true mattered less than the belief itself. You could almost feel the weight of those expectations pressing down every time you tightened your sword belt. There's something calming in the language of the code, too. Words like honor and loyalty have a lulling rhythm, a soft cadence that sounds reassuring when repeated in chapel or sung by minstrels. You hear them drifting in your ears as you drift towards sleep, half believing, half skeptical, but soothed by the idea that someone, somewhere, thought to give warriors a script to follow. That is the chivalric code, noble on parchment, messy in practice, inspiring in song, compromised in life. You close your eyes tonight, wondering which version of yourself tomorrow will demand the shining protector or the tired, flawed man beneath the armor. And the answer, as ever, will hover somewhere in between. The code is still echoing in your ears when the clang of hammers and the cheers of crowds pull you into a new arena tournaments. If the battlefield was chaos, then this was ritualized chaos, dressed in banners and accompanied by music. You stand at the edge of the lists, the long wooden barrier separating two riders, and you can feel your stomach churn with equal parts dread and anticipation. Contemporary records leave no doubt. Tournaments were central to a knight's life from the 12th century onward. They were not only training grounds but also spectacles, half sport, half war, where reputation could be made or broken. You imagine your lance quivering under your arm, your visor lowering with a creak, the roar of spectators filling your ears. A single gallop forward might bring triumph, or it might end with you sprawled in the dust, dignity dented, ribs bruised. And yet tournaments carried quirks as colourful as their banners. One chronicler tells of a knight who showed up late to the joust, his armour half buckled, still chewing a piece of roast chicken. Another report describes squires sneaking wine into the stables so their masters could drink for courage, only to wobble unsteadily in the saddle. You laugh to yourself, imagining a knight tilting down the lists, hiccuping between shouts of, "For honour!" It's ridiculous, but somehow very human. The sensory storm of a tournament was unforgettable. Trumpets blared, hooves thundered, the wooden tilt splintered when lances shattered. The smell of trampled grass and sweating horses mingled with roasted meat from nearby feasting tents. You felt every impact vibrate through your bones, the lance jarring your arm, the armor ringing like a bell when struck. Even as you gasp for air under your helmet, you hear the crowd surge with noise, gasps, laughter, cheers as though your fate is a public game. Scholars remain divided on whether tournaments were primarily training or primarily theatre. Some argue they sharpened real combat skills, giving knights a safer venue to practice charges and melee. Others point out that tournaments often devolved into reckless brawls, more about prestige and prize money than meaningful preparation. You can sense both sides of the argument as you tighten your grip on the reins. Yes, you are practicing, but you're also performing, hoping your crest and courage will win admiration as much as skill. Beyond jousting, tournaments often included full melees, groups of knights charging at one another across fields, fighting in teams until exhaustion won. These melees could grow so violent that deaths were common, armor dented, bones broken. Imagine yourself trapped in a swirl of dust and iron, swinging wildly at anything that moves, praying not to be crushed beneath hooves. For all their pageantry, tournaments reminded you that violence was never far beneath the surface. Still, tournaments also served as networking events. Lords scouted talent, ladies handed favors, poets composed songs. You might stagger off the field with a bruised shoulder, but still catch a glance from a noblewoman in the stands, her silk sleeve fluttering in your hand later as proof you were seen. That sleeve, tied to your lance, might matter more than the broken rib you nursed. And the prizes could be lucrative. Victorious knights sometimes claimed their opponent's horse or armor as spoils, wealth worth a small fortune. A single successful joust might repay months of debt. You can almost feel the thrill of leading a captured destrier away, its reins heavy in your hand, knowing it will feed both your pride and your purse. At night, the camp around the tournament grounds came alive. Fires crackled, minstrels strummed lutes, gamblers shouted, cooks sold meat pies dripping with grease. You sit with your fellow knights, bruised but exhilarated, trading stories of near misses and spectacular crashes. Someone teases you for nearly falling off your horse. You fire back about his bent lance. The camaraderie blunts the pain, turning the day's violence into tomorrow's jokes. That is the training tournament. Equal parts battlefield rehearsal, carnival spectacle, and social theatre. You close your eyes tonight with your body sore, your ears still ringing with cheers, and your dreams filled with the rush of hooves thundering down a sunlit list. Your ribs are still sore from the last tilt, but there is no rest. Tonight you're not in the practice yard or the melee field, you're at a banquet table, squeezed between noblemen who smell of roast pork and spiced wine. Being a knight means more than charging with a lance. It means surviving the endless parade of feasts and courtly rituals, where a wrong gesture can ruin your reputation faster than a broken lance. One thing the records make clear is that knights were expected to master court life as much as combat. Manuals of conduct survive from the Middle Ages, teaching everything from how to cut meat politely to when to speak in a lord's hall. You imagine yourself clutching a knife, hands trembling, trying not to send a hunk of venison flying into a baron's lap. One careless move, and all your hard-won dignity vanishes in laughter. And yet, court life came with eccentric moments too. Chroniclers note that food at these feasts was sometimes absurd. Entire peacocks roasted and redressed in their own feathers, pies filled with live birds that escaped when cut open, or trenchers piled so high with grease that pages slipped while carrying them. You picture yourself leaning over the table as a swan, gilded in gold leaf, is plopped down in front of you, looking more like a sculpture than supper. The room fills with applause, and you wonder whether to eat it or admire it. The sensory assault of the feast is unforgettable. Torches flare against painted walls, music swells from lutes and fiddles, the clatter of knives mixes with bursts of laughter. The smell of cinnamon and cloves lingers above the heavier scents of meat and ale. You sip wine sweet, spiced, warming your chest and nibble bread still warm from the oven. The air is heavy, almost intoxicating, and yet you feel the tension under it all. Every word, every gesture, every laugh at the wrong moment is watched, weighed, remembered. Scholars continue to puzzle over the true purpose of these gatherings. Were they celebrations of fellowship, reinforcing bonds between warriors? Or were they carefully staged performances where lords displayed wealth and knights competed for favor? The surviving evidence suggests both. For you, sitting stiffly on a bench, it feels like a test less dangerous than battle, perhaps, but no less nerve-wracking. And of course, the feast was where politics happened. Deals whispered between bites, alliances sealed with toasts, rivalries sharpened over goblets of wine. You imagine leaning closer as your lord exchanges quiet words with another baron, your role not to speak but to listen, to remember. Later your knight may question you. Did you hear what he promised? The banquet hall is not only a stage for manners, but a battlefield of influence. Its weapons subtler, but its stakes just as high. Amid the gravity, there's humour too. Perhaps you laugh as a drunken knight slumps into his trenches, or wince when a minstrel's song goes flat. Perhaps you catch yourself staring too long at a noblewoman across the table, cheeks heating as she catches your eye. These small embarrassments humanize the grandeur, making it less of a painting and more of a living, breathing mess. At the end of the night, you're full, slightly tipsy, and exhausted. Your spurs jingle as you rise, trying not to stumble on the rushes covering the floor. You step out into the cool night air, the hall's music fading behind you. The stars above seem sharper, cleaner, as though reminding you that beyond all the performance, the real world remains vast and indifferent. That is feasting and court life, equal parts delight and danger, where your knife skills mattered as much as your swordsmanship, and where reputations were made not only in dust but in candlelight. You lie down tonight with the taste of wine still lingering, your dreams a blur of laughter, music, and the glitter of torches across silver goblets. The feast is over, but the music echoes in your head as you wander the torchlit corridors. Somewhere between the banquets and the battles, you stumble upon a different expectation of knighthood one whispered in poems, sung by minstrels, and embroidered into the sleeves of noble ladies. It's the ideal of courtly love, that strange mixture of romance, ritual, and performance that knights were supposed to master almost as carefully as swordplay. Documents of the time leave little doubt. A knight's reputation was shaped not only by his prowess in war, but also by his service to a lady. This didn't always mean marriage. In fact, it often didn't. It was about devotion, symbolic gestures, public declarations of admiration that tied a knight's honor to a woman's favor. You imagine yourself tying a ribbon or a silk sleeve to your lance before a tournament, your heart hammering as you ride past her pavilion. Did she notice? Did she smile? Or did she roll her eyes? The uncertainty gnaws at you. And then there are the oddities, the little flourishes that make the whole system feel both romantic and absurd. Some knights composed verses so clumsy that even the ladies they honored had to bite their lips to keep from laughing. One story tells of a young warrior who vowed to eat nothing but what his lady touched, an oath that ended when she teasingly dropped a crust of bread on the ground, daring him to chew it. You can picture yourself blushing furiously as your companions jeer, forced to choose between dignity and devotion. The sensory world of courtly love is rich and layered. Perfume lingers in the air, roses, lavender, spiced oils brought from far-off lands. You kneel on cold flagstones, offering a poem that your shaky voice nearly ruins, while lutes strum gently in the background. The hall is bright with tapestries, each woven with scenes of knights kneeling before queens, the images blurring into the reality you now try awkwardly to imitate. Your palms sweat more holding a lady's hand than they ever did gripping a sword hilt. Modern scholars disagree on just how widespread or sincere this whole system of love service really was. Some argue it was a real cultural phenomenon, shaping behavior across Europe. Others think it was mostly a literary construct, exaggerated by poets and troubadours to entertain courts hungry for drama. For you, standing there with your heart in your throat, it doesn't matter which side is right. The expectation is real, whether born of poetry or practice. And of course, the politics of romance were as sharp as any lance. Devotion to the right lady might bring you patronage, opportunities, protection. Choose unwisely, or let whispers of impropriety grow too loud, and you could find yourself disgraced, mocked, even punished. You imagine the sting of scandal spreading faster than wildfire, one awkward glance twisted into rumor, one clumsy poem turned into gossip repeated in every hall. Still, there's a sweetness too, the warmth of a smile when you least expect it, the rustle of silk as she moves past you in the hall, the thrill of carrying her token, however small, into battle, convincing yourself it makes you braver. You ride harder, fight fiercer, because somewhere, someone might be watching, and even if they are not, you believe that they might. By the end of the night, your armor feels lighter, your debts less crushing, your bruises less painful, all because of a gesture, a word, a ribbon tied to your lance. You lie on your straw mattress hearing the faint echo of a troubadour's song, and in your half-dreaming mind, you see her sleeve fluttering like a banner above you. That is love and lady service. Equal parts performance and passion. Absurd and touching. Fleeting and unforgettable. It reminds you that knights weren't only judged by how they fought, but by how they loved, or at least how convincingly they pretended to. The silk ribbon is still tied to your lance in memory when another duty tugs at you, one not to a lady, not to a lord, but to heaven itself. A knight, you are told, is not complete without piety. Service of the sword must be balanced by service of the soul. And so, you find yourself lacing worn boots at dawn, preparing for pilgrimage. One reliable reality preserved in chronicles is that many knights were expected, at least once in their lives, to journey to a holy site. It might be a nearby shrine of a local saint, or it might be something grander. Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, or even Jerusalem itself. The journey tested endurance as surely as battle did, and its symbolism mattered deeply. You imagine trudging along a muddy road, staff in hand, armor left behind, your knees stiff, your heart murmuring prayers with each step. The oddities of these journeys make them strangely vivid. Some knights, eager to prove their devotion, walked barefoot for hundreds of miles. Others carried heavy chains as penance, clanking like prisoners with every step. There's even a tale of one who vowed not to shave until he reached Rome, arriving wild-haired and bearded, more hermit than warrior. You picture yourself stumbling into a village, feet blistered, face sunburned, smelling worse than the horses you once groomed, and yet holding your head high because your suffering was proof of devotion. The sensory impressions of pilgrimage are different from war or court. The air smells of dust, wild herbs crushed beneath your boots, the faint sweetness of roadside chapels where incense lingers. Bells toll as you pass through towns, voices rising in a dozen dialects, bread baking in ovens that tempt your empty stomach. At night, you curl on a hard floor in a crowded inn, the snores of strangers mixing with the creak of the rafters. It is not glamorous, but it carries its own rhythm, step after step, prayer after prayer. Scholars continue to debate the sincerity of knightly piety. Some insist that knights truly believed these pilgrimages cleansed their sins and bound them closer to God. Others suspect it was often theatre, a way to display holiness publicly while enjoying the travel and prestige of the journey. Either way, the effect was real. Returning from pilgrimage marked you as devout, a knight not only of the sword but of the spirit. And pilgrimages often carried political undertones. A lord might sponsor his vassal's trip as a sign of piety for the whole household. Kings sometimes undertook grand journeys to display their humility. Even your choice of destination could speak volumes: Santiago to honor Spain, Canterbury to please the English crown, Rome to show obedience to the Pope. Your blistered feet became political statements as much as spiritual ones. Strangely, the hardships themselves became points of pride. You swapped stories with other pilgrims: how far you'd walked without food, how many times you'd slept on bare earth, how many relics you'd kissed along the way. The scars and calluses felt like invisible medals. You picture yourself holding up cracked heels to your companions, all of you laughing through the pain, comparing who had the worst blisters, as if they were trophies. By the time you return home, thinner, wearier, perhaps with a scallop shell pinned to your cloak as proof of Santiago, you carry more than a token. You carry the memory of struggle, of humility, of faith tested by long roads and endless prayers. You return to your armor changed, not only heavier with debt and duty, but lighter with a sense of perspective. That is pilgrimage and piety. Slow, grinding, sometimes ridiculous, sometimes profound. It strips you down not to expose weakness, but to remind you that knighthood isn't only about lance and sword. It's also about bare feet on dusty roads, whispered prayers in crumbling chapels, and the fragile hope that all the suffering might make you just a little closer to the ideal you swore to uphold. You lie down tonight with aching legs, but your dreams are calm-filled, not with battle cries, but with bells ringing gently over distant hills. Your feet have barely healed from the pilgrimage, when another call beckons, this time not to a shrine but to a brotherhood. For some knights, the path led beyond service to a single lord and into the ranks of military orders, where vows of chastity and poverty intertwined with the clash of steel. You imagine standing in a solemn hall, torchlight flickering on stone as men in identical cloaks chant prayers, their swords gleaming beneath white or black crosses. Chroniclers leave no ambiguity about their significance. The Knights Templar, founded in the early 12th century, and the Hospitallers, born from a charitable order in Jerusalem, were among the most famous. These groups fused monastic devotion with military might. Joining meant you gave up wealth, family, even personal freedom, binding yourself to the order's rules. For many, it was both an escape from worldly troubles and an elevation into a sacred mission. But within these solemn vows lurked oddities. For example, Templars were forbidden to kiss their mothers or sisters, a precaution against temptation so strict it became almost comical. Hospitallers, known for tending the sick, sometimes doubled as innkeepers for pilgrims, meaning you might go from battlefield to kitchen duty in a single week. You picture yourself hauling a pot of stew while still wearing chainmail, the mixture of garlic and iron clinging stubbornly to your nose. The sensory atmosphere of an order's life was unique. Instead of the roar of a feast hall, you heard daily prayers chanted in chorus. Instead of embroidered silks, you wore plain cloaks marked with stark crosses. The food was simple bread, beans, watered wine, and the dormitories echoed with the sound of dozens of men breathing in unison. Yet amid the austerity, there was strength. You felt part of something vast, a tide of warriors bound not by lord or land but by faith. Historians still wrestle with the true character of these orders. Were they primarily pious defenders of pilgrims, as their charters proclaimed, or ruthless power brokers amassing wealth and influence under a religious cloak? The Templars in particular became so wealthy that kings borrowed money from them until those same kings turned on the order, accusing them of heresy. The debate continues, and you feel the weight of it as you imagine kneeling in that solemn hall, uncertain whether you're joining saints or schemers. Yet for knights who sought purpose, the orders offered clarity. Instead of balancing a dozen conflicting loyalties, you had one: God, expressed through your brotherhood. The rules simplified life. You rose at the bell, prayed at the bell, rode to war at the bell. Your sword belonged not to your ambition, but to the order's mission. That surrender of self, though daunting, brought a strange peace. There were moments of camaraderie, too, that went unrecorded in official statutes. Shared jokes whispered in the dormitory, laughter muffled under cloaks, the occasional prank involving swapped boots or misplaced prayer books. These tiny rebellions made the rigid structure bearable, turning solemnity into something more human. You imagine chuckling under your breath as a stern brother scolds you, his own lips twitching with suppressed amusement. And there were moments of grandeur. Picture riding in formation, hundreds of white mantles fluttering, crosses blazing in the sun, the earth trembling beneath synchronized hooves. Villagers gawked, pilgrims wept with relief, enemies trembled. For a brief time, you weren't just a man, you were a symbol, part of a living wall of faith and steel. Yet you also sensed the danger of being consumed by that symbol. Would your individuality vanish entirely? Would your life become just another tally mark in the order's ledger? The question lingers as you lay down on your straw mattress, cloak folded neatly at your side. That is the life within knightly orders, austere, disciplined, tinged with both holiness and irony. You drift into dreams of chanting voices, of banners marked with crosses, of battles fought not only for lords or land, but for something you hope is eternal. The chanting of the brotherhood fades, and now another voice begins to shape your path, not the command of a lord or the call of a priest, but the songs of storytellers. You hear it in the marketplace, in the echoing halls of castles, in the soft strum of a lute beneath a torch. Knights, it turns out, are not only made on battlefields and in chapels, they are also invented in literature, reshaped into legends more dazzling than any reality could bear. Contemporary manuscripts leave no doubt. The 12th and 13th centuries saw an explosion of romances, tales of Arthur and his round table, Roland and his horn, Tristan and his doomed love. These stories gave knights scripts to follow, ideals to imitate. You picture yourself leaning close to the fire while a bard sings of Sir Lancelot's bravery, your chest swelling with pride and envy. The story tells you who you are supposed to be, even if the mirror shows someone far muddier and more exhausted. The quirks of these tales are hard not to smile at. Some knights slayed dragons so improbably large you wonder whether the poet had ever even seen a lizard. Others wooed ladies with speeches so syrupy that real-life knights must have groaned trying to imitate them. You imagine yourself scribbling a clumsy verse. Your hair is like, wheat? Then tossing the parchment in despair because the minstrel at court just made everyone swoon with lines about golden tresses outshining dawn. The sensory world of literature is softer, dreamier. The smell of vellum pages, ink still fresh. The sound of a bard's voice, rising and falling with practiced rhythm, mingling with the crackle of logs. You hear children sigh with delight. Noble women clasp their hands, and even grizzled warriors lean closer, eyes glinting with longing for a life more glamorous than the one they live. The hall feels warmer, brighter, gilded by imagination. Modern scholars remain divided about just how much influence these stories truly wielded. Some argue knights earnestly tried to model themselves after Lancelot or Galahad, reshaping their conduct to match poetic ideals. Others claim the opposite, that literature exaggerated wildly, creating fantasies no real knight ever bothered to chase. The truth, as usual, likely lies between. Knights borrowed what suited them: courage here, romantic flair there, while ignoring the less convenient virtues. And yet, the power of stories cannot be denied. You sense it in your own heart as you drift towards sleep, the lines between bardic fiction and lived experience blurring. Did Roland really blow his horn so loudly that mountains split? Probably not. But does it matter? The image still stirs something in you, urging you to imagine yourself holding that horn, calling for aid in the moment of despair. Stories also shaped reputation. A knight who won a joust might be immortalized in verse, his deeds sung across counties he'd never visited. You imagine blushing as a minstrel rhymes your name with flame in a ballad, exaggerated until you hardly recognize yourself. Perhaps you laugh, but secretly, you treasure it. For once, someone paints you not as a mud-spattered man with debts and bruises, but as a figure of glory. Of course, not all knights approved. Some grumbled that poets made them out to be love-struck dreamers instead of hardened fighters. Others worried the gap between story and reality set impossible expectations. You picture an old veteran snorting into his ale, muttering, "Dragons? If only battles were that simple." And still, when the song begins, even he leans closer, caught despite himself. That is the power of literature, to mold knights as much as lords or priests ever did. It gave you a mirror that showed not what you were, but what you might be or what you wished others to believe. Tonight, as you stretch out on your straw bed, you hear the faint melody of a minstrel's song echoing through your dreams. And for once, you see yourself not only as a weary man, but as a legend. The minstrel's voice fades, leaving you staring into the embers of a fire and wondering, was knighthood truly the same everywhere? The stories painted one grand image, but reality was fractured. Knights in France lived differently from those in England, and differently again from those in the German lands. To understand knighthood, you must travel in your mind across Europe, tasting the flavors of its many variations. Contemporary records remind us that France was often considered the cradle of chivalry. Here, the code was dressed in its richest robes, elaborate dubbing ceremonies, courts bursting with troubadours, and tournaments run with strict formality. You picture yourself at a French court, banners fluttering, nobles reciting polished verses, every movement tinged with ceremony. Even the armor gleams brighter here, or at least it seems so in memory. Knights of France were expected not only to fight but to embody elegance itself. England, by contrast, leaned more toward pragmatism. The Norman conquest had introduced French customs, yes, but English lords remained fiercely practical. Records show that knights there were as likely to be used for enforcing law and managing estates as for tournaments. You imagine yourself patrolling muddy roads, your horse splashing through puddles, villagers bowing as you pass. It lacks the glamour of a French court, but it cements knighthood as part of governance, not just spectacle. And then there were the German lands, fractured principalities, endless rivalries. Here, knights often served minor lords or even city councils. Their loyalty spread thin across shifting allegiances. The chronicles speak of endless feuds, castle sieges between neighbors, violence that seemed less about noble ideals and more about raw survival. You picture yourself on a rocky hillside, staring at yet another half-built fortress, your sword feeling more like a tool of debt collection than a holy instrument. Yet across these regions, quirks cropped up that made each flavor unique. In France, knights sometimes swore oaths tied to extravagant quests, vowing not to cut their hair until they'd achieved some daring feat. In England, local ballads poked fun at knights who couldn't manage their lands, painting them as laughable as tax collectors. In the German territories, you find tales of robber knights, men of noble blood who turned to outright banditry, charging tolls on bridges or raiding merchants until their reputations soured. You can almost hear travelers muttering curses at yet another toll gate, another so-called knight demanding coin with a smirk. The sensory world of these differences is striking. In France, the scent of roses and spiced wine drifts through candle-lit halls. In England, the smell of rain-soaked wool cloaks clings to you as you ride patrols. In Germany, smoke from burning farmsteads and the clang of makeshift fortresses fill your nights. Same title, same armor, but the taste of knighthood shifts like dialects on the wind. Modern historians remain divided on which region best embodied true knighthood. Some insist France set the gold standard, its rituals defining the European model. Others argue England's practicality kept knighthood grounded, or that Germany's fractured politics revealed its raw essence. You, listening to their voices in your imagination, suspect they are all right and all wrong at once. Knighthood was never one thing. It was many, overlapping, conflicting, evolving. And yet, wherever you go, the identity of knight carries weight. In a French hall, you are judged by your courtesy. In England, by your ability to serve crown and county. In Germany, by whether you can hold your castle against rivals. The expectations differ, but the gaze is always there, pressing, watching, demanding. So as you drift tonight, you imagine yourself journeying across Europe, each step changing your role slightly. You wear brighter silks in France, sturdier cloaks in England, battered armor in Germany. Each version of yourself is still a knight, and yet each smells, sounds, and feels different. That, perhaps, is the most telling truth. Knighthood was not a single melody but a whole chorus, sometimes harmonious, often discordant, but always unmistakable. You've wandered across France, England, and Germany in your mind, seeing knights shaped by land and politics, but the stories rarely mention another possibility that sometimes knighthood bent its rigid rules far enough to let women step into the saddle. The image is unusual, unexpected, even controversial, but it flickers in the chronicles. Women arming themselves, leading troops, or being honored with the title in exceptional circumstances. One well-documented case is that of Joan of Arc in 15th century France. Though never formally knighted in the conventional sense, she wore armor, carried a banner, and led armies as if she were one of the Brotherhood. Earlier still, accounts from southern France and Catalonia speak of women known as chevaleresses, ladies recognized for service or granted the dignity of the title alongside their husbands. You picture yourself in the crowd as a woman rides past in gleaming mail, whispers rippling through the onlookers half in awe, half in disbelief. The quirks of these exceptions sparkle in memory. In German tales, a woman named Duchess Agnes was said to have donned armor during a siege, rallying defenders when morale faltered. Another account describes noblewomen training with crossbows to defend castles in their husband's absence. And in literature, female knights like Britomart in The Fairy Queen or Bradamante in Italian epics fought and loved with the same passion as their male counterparts. You can almost hear the delighted gasps of listeners as a bard sings of a woman toppling foes with her lance. The sensory impression of such moments is striking. Imagine the hush inside a hall when a lady enters wearing armor, the metallic scent mingling with her perfume. The torchlight glints on steel shaped for a smaller frame, and every eye watches as she fastens a sword belt with hands as steady as any man's. Outside, peasants murmur at the sight of a female figure astride a warhorse, banners streaming behind her in the wind. Researchers today remain divided on just how common such women truly were. Some argue they were rare exceptions, magnified into legend because of their novelty. Others suggest more women took on martial roles than records reveal, their names erased or softened into myth, because scribes found it unsettling. As you lie in the shadows of history, you sense the tug of both arguments. Perhaps there were more armored women than the chronicles admit. Perhaps they were only sparks against the night, but sparks bright enough to leave trails centuries later. And what did these women face? Admiration, yes, but also suspicion. Whispers about propriety, about unnatural roles. To step into knighthood as a woman meant walking a tightrope, earning respect from comrades, while enduring scorn from those who saw it as defiance of divine order. You imagine the steel weight of not just armor, but expectation and judgment pressing down all at once. Still, the stories linger for a reason. They remind you that the ideal of knighthood, so often painted as male and unbending, could stretch in unexpected ways. The creak of a saddle doesn't sound different if the rider is a woman. The shimmer of chainmail doesn't change its glow. The courage beneath it, the resolve in the eyes, those are universal. That is the rare but potent story of women and knighthood, part history, part legend, part whispered debate. As you drift into sleep tonight, you see a figure riding beside you in the half-light, her armor glinting, her banner high. She does not vanish when you close your eyes. She rides with you into the dream, reminding you that knighthood was always larger, stranger, and more varied than the rules claimed. The memory of that woman in armor lingers as you ride onward, but now your thoughts drift toward another possibility: knighthood without noble birth. Could a man of common stock, with no crest or estate, ever rise into the ranks? The rules of inheritance and wealth said no, but life, unpredictable as always, sometimes said yes. Documents from the later Middle Ages record that a handful of common-born men did claw their way into knighthood. Most often, this happened on the battlefield. A soldier who displayed extraordinary courage could be knighted in the field, sometimes after saving his lord's life, other times by sheer ferocity that could not be ignored. You picture yourself, muddy and bloodied, falling to your knees in shock as a commander taps a sword on your shoulder in the middle of carnage, raising you from obscurity to knighthood in a single breath. The quirks of such stories make them unforgettable. In one case, a man was knighted because, in the chaos of combat, he seized an enemy standard and refused to let it fall despite being wounded. In another, a commander, short on trained nobles, dubbed several stout-hearted peasants mid-battle just so they could legally fight in the mounted ranks. You imagine the astonishment on the faces of those men yesterday carrying pitchforks, today sworn as knights. A dream too wild even to believe, and yet it happened. The sensory reality of these battlefield knighthoods was raw. No torches, no silk robes, no choirs humming in chapels. Instead, the stink of smoke and blood, the clang of weapons still ringing, and a sword hilt sticky with sweat as it pressed against your shoulder. The voices were hoarse, the gestures hurried, but the meaning carried no less weight. Scholars remain divided on how meaningful such knightings truly were. Some argue they proved knighthood could be earned by valor, a reward for skill and loyalty rather than birth. Others suggest they were exceptions tolerated in emergencies, with such men often looked down upon afterward, treated as impostors among true knights. You sense both perspectives in your imagination, the pride of the newly dubbed, and the sneers of nobles muttering behind goblets at feasts. And then there were paths through wealth. A few wealthy merchants or officials could purchase land, equip themselves as mounted warriors, and eventually be recognized as knights. This was rarer, but it chipped away at the boundaries. You imagine a burgher's son strapping on armor, paid for by trade in wool or spices, his crest new, his title fresh, his acceptance grudging. Behind his back, whispers, bought, not earned. And yet, when he rode into battle, did the arrows care about his pedigree? The human detail is striking. Some of these commoner knights overcompensated, becoming fanatical about honor, stricter about etiquette than their noble peers, desperate to prove they belonged. Others embraced their unusual status, proud of having earned rather than inherited the title. You picture yourself torn between the two impulses, standing tall with pride, then shrinking under suspicion, then swelling again when victory proved your worth. In the end, these rare stories reveal the cracks in the rigid walls of medieval society. For all the pomp and ceremony, for all the talk of lineage and estates, courage and opportunity sometimes pried open doors. Not often, not easily, but enough to remind everyone that blood was not the only path to spurs. That is the story of knighthood for commoners. Fleeting, controversial, but tantalizing. As you lay down tonight, you let yourself imagine the impossible, your name, not noble by birth, carried in the songs of minstrels, your crest fluttering on a shield, your title spoken with respect. Dreams have a way of ignoring rules, and for once, so did history. The idea of knighthood for commoners still hangs in your thoughts when you hear a louder, more insistent call, a call not from your lord or your heart, but from across the sea. The word crusade sweeps through Europe like wildfire, carried by papal bulls, fiery sermons, and whispered promises of salvation. Suddenly, the dream of knighthood expands beyond feasts and tournaments into something vast and terrifying: holy war. Chroniclers leave no doubt about the scale of this movement. Beginning in the late 11th century, thousands of knights took the cross, vowing to march east to reclaim Jerusalem and defend Christian pilgrims. To be a crusader was to be part of a grand story, one that promised spiritual rewards as rich as earthly ones. You picture yourself kneeling in a crowded square, a priest stitching a red cloth cross to your tunic, the crowd cheering as if you've already achieved sainthood. The quirks of crusading life, though, make the romance far more complicated. Some knights pawned their lands to finance the journey, leaving families destitute if they never returned. Others joined less from faith than from desperation, hoping the East would bring riches or adventure they couldn't find at home. One story tells of a knight who, unable to afford proper gear, painted a cross on his shield with blood from a cut finger, vowing that was sacrifice enough. You can almost see him grinning grimly, the crude red mark drying unevenly on wood. The sensory shock of crusading is unforgettable. Imagine stepping off a ship into the blistering heat of the Levant, the air thick with spices you don't recognize, the sun hammering down on your helmet until the metal burns your skin. You smell strange incense in Eastern churches, taste food spiced with cinnamon and cumin instead of salt and garlic. The clash of cultures overwhelms as much as the clash of swords. You feel both wonder and dread, alien in a land where your very presence marks you as both pilgrim and invader. Modern historians remain sharply divided about the true nature of the Crusades. Were they primarily religious wars, driven by genuine devotion and the promise of indulgences? Or were they, at heart, campaigns of conquest and plunder cloaked in piety? The debate still burns, and as you stand in your mind's eye on a dusty battlefield beneath the blazing sun, you feel the weight of both answers pressing in. And then comes combat sieges that drag on for months, the screams of defenders and attackers alike echoing off stone walls. You imagine yourself pushing a siege tower forward, your hands blistering on rough wood, arrows raining down, the air filled with smoke and ash. You hear foreign voices shouting from the walls, the words unintelligible but the defiance unmistakable. Every step forward feels like dragging your soul through fire. Yet crusading also brought strange rewards. Some knights returned with relics, splinters of supposed holy wood, bones of saints, vials of dust from sacred ground. Others returned with exotic animals or silks, treasures that dazzled their villages. You picture yourself opening a chest back home, revealing fabrics so bright they look unreal, while wide-eyed peasants gasp as though you've brought a piece of heaven itself. The human reality was harsher. Many never came back at all. Some died in battle, others from disease, heat stroke, or starvation. Some lingered in the east, marrying, settling, blending lives into a frontier far removed from the cold fields of Europe. The Crusades turned knighthood into something global, stretching your identity beyond borders, but they also left scars deeper than any lance wound. That is the Crusader's path. Half pilgrimage, half war, fueled by faith, ambition, and sometimes desperation. You lie down tonight with the image of a red cross glowing faintly against your tunic, the memory of hot sun and foreign incense drifting through your dreams, and the uneasy sense that your knighthood is no longer bound by your homeland alone. The roar of crusade drums still thunders in your ears when you return home and find yourself facing a very different reality. No more desert heat, no more siege towers, no banners of conquest. Now you are expected to manage land. For many knights, this was the part of their life that lasted longest. Not the battles, but the endless cycle of farming seasons, rents, and obligations. Knighthood, it turns out, was as much about ledger books as lances. The records of manorial rolls remind us that knights were often granted fiefs, pieces of land held in return for military service. With these came peasants who owed labour or rent. You picture yourself trudging through damp fields at dawn, cloak pulled tight, as tenants bow awkwardly, hoping their payments will be enough. Your hand rests on your sword, but the day's battle is not with enemies on horseback, it's with debts, shortages, and grumbling villagers. And then come the oddities. Some knights were so bad at estate management that chroniclers mocked them outright. One tale tells of a knight who spent more on hawks and hounds than his land produced, leaving his peasants destitute. Another speaks of knights trying to demand rent in the form of unusual goods, geese with silver collars, or baskets of fish delivered to the hall on holy days. You chuckle imagining yourself bargaining with a farmer over whether a barrel of ale really equals the annual rent. The sensory impressions here are less glamorous but just as real. The smell of wet earth after ploughing, the creak of barns, the sharp tang of dung in farmyards. Inside the hall, smoke from a hearth fire curls upward, mingling with the sour scent of parchment and ink as you tally rents. Your sword belt digs into your waist as you lean over the table, more bureaucrat than warrior, quill scratching as loudly as any lance against a shield. Historians remain divided on whether knights enjoyed this side of their duties or endured it. Some argue landholding cemented their status, giving them real power and stability. Others suggest many knights found it tedious, longing for tournaments and campaigns, rather than harvest disputes and tax collection. You can sense the truth in both. Some evenings you relish the security of bread and ale from your own stores. Other nights you stare into the fire and ache for the clash of hooves and the rush of banners. But this landlord's role was essential. Without income from fiefs, you couldn't maintain armor, horses, or retainers. The battlefield glamour depended on these muddy fields. Every grain tithed, every chicken delivered, every acre sown kept your knighthood alive. You realize, perhaps with reluctant respect, that peasants' labor was the foundation on which your shining spurs stood. Still, human comedy thrived even here. Picture a surly miller accused of skimming grain, a pig escaping into the hall during rent collection, children snickering as they watch you, the supposedly mighty knight, trip in the mud. These moments punctured pride, but they also made life bearable. They reminded you that knighthood was not constant grandeur but a blend of dignity and absurdity. And sometimes, duty became genuine connection. A kind knight might sponsor repairs to a villager's roof or feast his tenants at Christmas, sharing meat and ale. Bonds grew, grudges softened, and the knight became not only lord but neighbour. You imagine yourself lifting a child onto your horse, her laughter ringing in the cold air, and for a moment your role feels less about command and more about guardianship. That is knighthood as landlord, less sung about, less glamorous, but just as defining. You drift into sleep tonight not with the clang of swords in your ears, but with the lowing of cattle, the rustle of parchment, and the steady heartbeat of the land beneath you, the quiet, stubborn foundation of all your shining dreams. The fields fade from your dreams, but the duties of landholding twist into something else: responsibility for justice. As a knight, you are not only master of farms and rents, you are also expected to uphold order. That means riding the roads, hearing complaints, sometimes even doling out punishment. Your sword no longer swings just at enemies in battle, but also at thieves, raiders, and quarrelsome neighbours. Legal records from the Middle Ages make it plain. Knights often served as enforcers of local law, acting in the name of their lords or the crown. You imagine yourself patrolling a muddy road at dusk, visor lifted, eyes scanning hedgerows for outlaws. Behind you, peasants trudge home from market, comforted by the sight of armed protection or unnerved, depending on your reputation. The creak of leather, the clink of spurs, the thud of hooves, these become the soundtrack of security. And then there were the oddities of medieval justice. One knight, tasked with resolving a boundary dispute, supposedly settled it by planting his spear in the ground and declaring, "Here it stays, here's the border." Another tale tells of a knight who punished poachers by making them carry a stag's antlers through the village as public shame. You picture yourself struggling not to laugh as a red-faced man lumbers past, antlers tied to his shoulders, children jeering as if it were a festival game. The sensory reality of this role is mixed. You hear the whimpering of a thief tied to a post, the mutter of villagers debating whether punishment is fair. The smell of sweat, fear, and wood smoke fills the air as you preside over disputes. Sometimes the job feels honourable, helping a widow reclaim stolen grain. Other times it feels cruel, dragging a desperate beggar before a lord for stealing bread. Scholars continue to argue about how effective knights really were in keeping the peace. Some claim they acted as stabilizing forces, deterring crime through their presence. Others suggest knights often abused their power, extorting peasants, bending justice for profit or pride. Perhaps both are true. You can almost hear two voices in your own head, one whispering that you are protector, the other warning that you are predator. At times, the responsibility pressed heavily. You might be called to escort merchants across bandit-ridden lands, your sword drawn as shadows flicker among trees. You feel the tension of every creak, every rustle, waiting for ambush. Or you might be tasked with suppressing unrest, facing angry villagers who hurl stones while you raise a shield, knowing you are caught between loyalty to your lord and empathy for their hunger. Yet there were lighter moments too. Some patrols ended with nothing more than listening to gossip at taverns, sipping ale while locals spun stories of phantom robbers who never appeared. You imagine yourself leaning back, pretending vigilance, while secretly enjoying the warmth of the hearth and the murmur of voices. In the end, law and order gave knighthood a new dimension. You were not only warrior or landholder, you were judge, guard, sometimes executioner. The role blurred lines, making you both feared and relied upon. Each decision carved a mark in memory. Protect too little, and people curse you. Punish too harshly, and they fear you. That is the knight's duty in law and order. Uneasy, contradictory, vital. Tonight, as you stretch out on your bed of straw and wool, you hear echoes not of lances breaking, but of villagers' voices pleading, accusing, thanking, mocking. The sound lingers, quieter than battle horns but no less haunting. The voices of villagers fade into the distance, replaced by the sound of trumpets once more, but the notes are different now, softer, ceremonial. The great days of tournaments, once raw and dangerous, begin to feel less like training for war and more like theatre. You watch from the sidelines as knights thunder down the lists, but something is changing. The bruises are fewer, the rules stricter, and the audience is larger. The tournament is no longer preparation, it is performance. One thing the chronicles make clear is that by the late Middle Ages, tournaments had become more pageantry than practice. What began as chaotic melees across open fields transformed into choreographed jousts, carefully staged with barriers, officials, and heralds. You imagine yourself tightening your lance not to prepare for the battlefield, but to impress a crowd. The lists are lined with nobles in embroidered silks, ladies waving ribbons, musicians striking triumphant chords as if victory were guaranteed. And yet, tournaments still carried their quirks. In Burgundy, elaborate pas d'armes events grew popular, where a knight would guard a symbolic location, a bridge, a fountain, even a garden, challenging all comers until he was unhorsed or exhausted. In one famous case, a knight swore to defend a tree of shields, where challengers hung their crests before attempting combat. You picture yourself leaning on your lance beneath the branches, sweat trickling down your neck as you wait for yet another opponent, secretly praying the sun will set before another challenger arrives. The sensory details of these later tournaments leaned more toward theatre than blood. Trumpets blared more often than war cries. Silk banners snapped in the wind, carrying the smell of perfume and roasting meats from nearby feasting tents. The thud of hooves was still there, yes, but it was muffled by the laughter of spectators and the polite applause of courts. You felt yourself less a soldier, more an actor, performing a role written centuries earlier by poets and minstrels. Historians are not of one mind about this transformation. Some argue that these safe tournaments helped preserve chivalry in an age when real war was changing, keeping alive the rituals of honor even as cannons began to roar. Others claim the events were hollow, more spectacle than substance, distracting knights from their fading military relevance. You, sitting in the saddle at the edge of the lists, sense both truths. It is glorious to hear your name called by the herald, yet unsettling to know that your skills might matter less on the next battlefield than they do in the applause of the crowd. Still, tournaments remained central to knightly identity. Winning a joust brought not just prestige, but sometimes wealth gifts from nobles, even horses or armor seized as prizes. And for the young, it was still a chance to prove themselves. You imagine the nervous flutter in your stomach as you line up across from an opponent, lance lowered, crowd holding its breath. The impact rattles through your body, your vision swims, and for a moment you feel every eye on you. That rush never fades, even if the stakes are lower. But humor colored these spectacles as well. Accounts tell of knights toppling clumsily over the lists, armor stuck so firmly they had to be pried out by laughing squires. One story describes a nobleman so rotund his armor split at the seams mid-joust, leaving him sputtering like a boiled sausage before an amused audience. You chuckle, imagining yourself praying that your own straps hold tight as you gallop forward. Off the field, tournaments fed into feasting, dancing, and endless storytelling. Minstrels sang of the day's exploits, often exaggerating them until your modest tilt sounded like a Homeric epic. Ladies teased you, lords congratulated or mocked, and the air buzzed with gossip. The social life surrounding the jousts often mattered more than the actual contests. You can feel yourself basking in the glow of recognition, even as your bruises throb under your tunic. Yet, beneath the glitter, a quiet unease lingered. You sensed that these events were becoming more museum piece than preparation. War outside the lists was changing. Crossbows had already shown their power. Longbows had humbled proud knights at Crécy and Agincourt, and now whispers of gunpowder grew louder, promising a future where no armor could truly protect. As you tilt down the list, part of you knows this performance is becoming nostalgia in real time. Still, nostalgia has power. These tournaments gave you a chance to live the ideal one last time, to hear the cheers, to feel the wind against your visor, to see your crest painted boldly in the sun. They reminded everyone, peasants, nobles, even kings, of what knights once meant, even as the meaning slipped further away. That is the twilight of tournaments. Bright, glittering, absurd, and a little sad. You drift into sleep tonight, hearing the faint echo of trumpets, half lullaby, half dirge, as if the age of jousts were bowing out on stage while cannons waited in the wings. The trumpets of the tournament still echo faintly in your memory, but their music is drowned out by a new, harsher sound, the thunder of cannon fire. The 15th century arrives, and with it, a weapon that reshapes the very bones of knighthood. You stand on a hillside, visor lifted, watching stone walls crumble under the blast of powder and shot. For the first time in your life, you feel your armor isn't protection at all, but a relic. One undeniable reality is that the spread of gunpowder across Europe changed warfare permanently. No longer were castles impregnable, no longer did heavy cavalry dominate the battlefield as it once had. A knight in mail and plate, proud on his charger, could be felled by a gunner who cost a fraction of the price. You imagine yourself shifting uncomfortably in the saddle, hearing that sharp crack of a handgun, seeing the puff of smoke, and realizing that all your years of drilling with lances mean little against a lead ball traveling faster than sight. The oddities of this new era make you shake your head. Early firearms were wildly unreliable, sometimes exploding in the hands of the shooter, sometimes failing to fire altogether. Chroniclers describe gunners setting fuses with trembling fingers, squinting through acrid smoke, while knights sneered at the cowardice of killing from afar. You picture yourself muttering curses at the smell of sulphur while mocking an enemy gunner, only to duck seconds later as his shot ricochets alarmingly close. The sensory details are overwhelming. The acrid stench of burned powder chokes your throat. The air fills with a haze that stings the eyes, turning midday into dusk. The booming of cannon shakes the ground, rattling in your chest more than any war horn. And the sight walls splitting, stones tumbling, proud towers collapsing feels like watching the world you knew fall apart piece by piece. Scholars remain divided about how fast gunpowder truly erased knighthood's dominance. Some argue that knights adapted for centuries, fighting alongside cannons and even using handguns themselves. Others suggest the change was swift, that by the late 1402, the armored knight was already an anachronism, more symbol than soldier. You sense both truths in your bones. You still ride to war, but you feel the ground slipping away beneath your hooves. And with gunpowder came a shift in castles, too. The tall, elegant towers of earlier centuries gave way to squat, thick-walled fortifications designed to absorb cannon fire. You picture yourself riding past the ruins of a once proud fortress, stones blackened, walls cracked, weeds sprouting in courtyards that once rang with tournaments. The silence of abandonment presses harder on your chest than the noise of battle ever did. There were, of course, strange adaptations. Some knights strapped on thicker and thicker armor, to the point where a man could hardly move without assistance. One Italian duke was said to own a suit so heavy it required a crane to lift him onto his horse. You chuckle, imagining yourself dangling awkwardly from a pulley, praying nobody laughs before the battle even begins. But the truth is bitter. No armor, no matter how thick, could guarantee safety anymore. And so, many knights found themselves drifting into new roles. Some became commanders, directing armies rather than charging at the front. Others focused on ceremonial duties, serving as symbols of tradition while mercenaries and gunners did the hard fighting. You imagine yourself sitting in a war council, maps spread across a table, hearing engineers discuss powder supplies and cannon placements, while your trusty lance leans forgotten in the corner. The human side of this transition was painful. Imagine the pride of a knight raised since childhood to believe that valor in the saddle was the highest honor, now watching peasants with crude firearms bring down armored nobles. Rage boiled in many hearts, bitterness thick as ash. Yet beneath the anger was fear, fear of irrelevance, of becoming a fossil in your own lifetime. You feel that fear gnawing at you even now as you drift into thought. Still, even as battlefields changed, the image of the knight endured. At feasts, poets still sang of jousts, troubadours still told tales of Arthur, children still waved sticks as pretend lances. You might be outdated in war, but in imagination, in memory, in the cultural heartbeat of Europe, the knight still gleamed. And perhaps that, more than cannon fire, is what kept the dream alive. That is the story of gunpowder's arrival. A shattering, a transformation, a reminder that no tradition, however noble, is immune to change. You lie down tonight with the acrid smell of smoke still clinging to your nose, the rumble of cannon echoing through your chest, and the uneasy knowledge that knighthood's age of dominance is fading into twilight. The smoke of cannon fire drifts away, leaving you unsettled. You feel the ground shifting under your armored boots, the world moving faster than your spurs can carry you. Knights who once embodied the pinnacle of military strength now find themselves struggling to pay debts, to keep horses fed, to prove they still matter. For many, there is only one option left: to sell their swords for coin. You, once a vassal sworn to one lord, now stare at the uncertain life of a mercenary. One truth echoed in chronicles is that by the 15th century, free companies of knights and men-at-arms roamed Europe, hiring themselves to the highest bidder. These groups fought in Italy's endless city-state wars, in the 100 Years' War between England and France, and in countless local feuds. You picture yourself trudging into a bustling Italian piazza, banners snapping overhead, a captain announcing terms of service. There's no loyalty here, no sacred oath, only contracts inked with as much formality as any land deed. And within these bands, oddities flourished. Some companies took on names that sounded more like tavern jokes than fearsome armies: the White Company, the Free Lances, the Company of the Hat. One notorious band in France styled themselves the Great Company, and lived up to the name mostly by extorting terrified peasants, demanding food and shelter in exchange for not burning everything down. You imagine yourself sitting around a smoky campfire with these men, listening to their laughter as they compare nicknames and tally spoils, wondering how far you've drifted from the solemn vows of your dubbing knight. The sensory atmosphere of mercenary life is raw and restless. You smell damp tents, horse sweat mingling with the sour reek of wine-soaked soldiers. Coins clink in purses one night, vanish by dawn in gambling or brothels. The clash of swords is no longer tied to honor, but to wages. Even the banners look different. Less proud heraldry, more practical flags, dyed in whatever colors were cheapest. You sit polishing a dented breastplate, not for glory, but because rust eats faster than pay replaces. Modern scholars disagree about how to judge these mercenary knights. Some argue they were simply adapting, finding a way to survive in a world that no longer guaranteed land or secure patronage. Others condemn them as parasites, selling violence to the highest bidder and abandoning chivalry's ideals. You, sitting by the fire with empty pockets, feel the truth of both sides. You are surviving, yes, but survival tastes bitter when you recall oaths sworn in chapels long ago. And yet, mercenary life carried strange freedoms. No longer bound to a single lord, you chose your contracts. Some captains treated their men generously, dividing spoils fairly. Others ruled like tyrants, but at least you could walk away at the end of a campaign if you survived. You imagine the tense negotiations, coins spilled onto tables, parchment signed with flourishes, men cheering when the sums were high enough to promise wine and meat for a month. There were, too, flashes of camaraderie unlike any other. Fighting alongside strangers from across Europe, you learned new tricks of the sword, new curses in foreign tongues, new songs sung under tents. Around the fire, laughter rose, stories stretched into lies, and for a moment you felt less alone in the slow collapse of knighthood's old order. The brotherhood here was raw, unpolished but real. Still, danger was constant. Mercenaries often found themselves abandoned when lords defaulted on payment. Bands of unpaid soldiers turned on the countryside, raiding villages just to survive. You imagine the gnawing hunger, the frustration boiling into violence, the shame of becoming exactly the predator you once swore to protect peasants against. Each raid left a scar deeper than any wound, each desperate theft another reminder that the knightly ideal had slipped away. And there were other humiliations. Sometimes mercenaries found themselves dismissed mid-campaign, told their services were no longer needed, forced to march out of camp under jeers. Other times, cities barred gates against them, fearing their reputation for lawlessness. You picture yourself leaning on a spear outside locked walls, rain dripping off your visor, the taste of rejection sharp as iron. Yet mercenary life also gave rise to the very word that still lingers: freelance. A knight without fixed service, offering his lance freely to whomever would pay. The term carries both shame and pride. Shame, because it strips away the romance of loyalty. Pride, because it recognizes resilience, the ability to carve survival from a crumbling system. You can almost hear yourself muttering the word under your breath, unsure whether it sounds like insult or independence. And so, as night falls, you lie on a blanket thin as parchment, staring up at the shifting canvas of stars. You think of the vows once whispered over you, the vows of honor, piety, loyalty. You think of the coin jingling in your pouch, soon to vanish in tomorrow's tavern. You think of battles fought not for justice, but for wages. And you feel both hollow and hardened, shaped by the shifting tides of a world where cannon smoke blots out banners, and knights drift into mercenary shadows. That is the mercenary's path. Half survival, half betrayal, stripped of old glory but stubborn in its will to endure. You close your eyes tonight with the bitter taste of smoke and cheap wine in your mouth, dreaming of contracts signed in candlelight, and of lances lowered not for honor, but for coin. The clink of mercenary coin still rattles in your purse, when another truth begins to press, in a truth more unsettling than battlefield defeats or empty contracts. It is the slow realization that knights, once the center of medieval life, are no longer the shining stars of society. Their aura, that golden halo of prestige, begins to dim. You look around and see merchants with coffers fuller than your lord's treasury, lawyers wielding more influence than lances, and city councils shaping politics while armored men wait idly at gates. The age of knighthood is slipping, replaced not by warriors but by traders and townsfolk. The documentary evidence is clear. By the late 15th century, the rising wealth of the merchant class in cities like Florence, Bruges, and Lubeck often dwarfed the incomes of minor knights. These men of trade bought silks, hired guards, and commissioned art that outshone anything you could afford. You imagine yourself entering a town square and seeing a burgher strutting proudly in fur-lined robes, his purse heavy with coins, his house painted brighter than any knight's castle. Peasants bow to him more readily than they do to you. The humiliation is sharp. And then there are the oddities that sting all the more. Some merchants purchased titles outright, paying monarchs for knighthoods that came without bruises, battles, or pilgrimages. Others flaunted their wealth by sponsoring tournaments, sitting in places of honor while actual knights bled in the lists below. You picture yourself, sweat dripping down your neck in armor, glancing up to see a round-faced cloth dealer smiling smugly from a balcony, applauding with jeweled fingers that never once gripped a sword. The sensory experience of this decline is subtle but painful. You ride through a town, expecting awe, but the air smells of spice markets, of brewing ale, of coin-changing hands in busy stalls. The clatter of scales and ledgers drowns out the jingle of your spurs. Children chase one another shouting about exotic wares from the east, barely glancing at the knight in their midst. For the first time, you feel invisible. Scholars are split on whether this decline was inevitable or exaggerated. Some argue knights still retained symbolic importance, anchoring monarchies with their traditions, even as their military role shrank. Others insist they were steadily sidelined, tolerated as relics while cities, merchants, and bureaucrats quietly built the real power. In your heart, you know both readings hold truth. You are still greeted respectfully at a feast, yes, but you also see the merchant's purse outweighing your lance every time decisions are made. This fading aura leads to awkward adjustments. Some knights turn to display, investing in lavish armor engraved with gold, designed less for war than for parades. You imagine strapping on such a suit, so ornate it glitters like jewelry, yet so impractical it squeaks at every step, the visor fogging instantly. You march through town looking magnificent but utterly useless, part knight, part fashion model. Others leaned harder into their supposed virtues. Manuals on chivalry multiplied, repeating old ideals as if repetition could keep them alive. Priests preached of knightly duties, poets sang of gallant deeds, yet the very need to remind people suggests how fragile the image had become. You picture yourself sighing as yet another minstrel drones about the noble knight, while the crowd slips away to buy bolts of silk or haggle over spices. And there is humiliation too. Chronicles note that knights often found themselves mocked by commoners. Plays and satirical poems portrayed them as bumbling, broke, clinging to outdated customs. One farce told of a knight so poor he rode a donkey, his armor patched with tin, his pride battered worse than his shield. You feel the sting in your chest, imagining peasants laughing as you pass, the word knight sounding less like honor and more like a joke. Yet the decline carried moments of poignancy as well. In villages, some still looked up to knights, still told stories of brave defenders, still believed in the oath-bound protector. A child might tug at your cloak, eyes wide, asking if you truly fought in a crusade. For a heartbeat, you feel the glow return, fragile but real. The dream of knighthood lingers even as reality falters. So you find yourself in a strange limbo, too proud to abandon your title, too aware that its meaning is fading. You sip wine at feasts while merchants outshine you in silk. You ride patrols while bureaucrats issue decrees with more weight than your sword. You hear the old songs, but their notes sound faint, as if echoing from a distant age. That is the fading aura of knighthood, gradual, humiliating, poignant. You lie down tonight with the rustle of parchment and coins louder than the clang of armor, and you dream uneasily of a future where spurs jingle only in memory, not in power. The laughter of burghers and the creak of merchant scales fade into silence, replaced by something stranger, a painter's brush scratching softly across canvas, a scribe's quill gliding over parchment, a mason chiseling figures into stone. You begin to realize that even as knights lost ground in real life, they gained immortality in memory. The age of chivalry, fading on the battlefield, found new life in art, in legend, in the stories told long after the clang of steel fell quiet. One well-attested reality is that, during the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, knights appeared everywhere in cultural expression. Chronicles, romances, tapestries, stained glass all immortalized the figure of the knight as a shining symbol of virtue. You imagine yourself walking into a cathedral, sunlight streaming through windows where armored saints kneel before altars, their spurs glinting in colored glass. The artistry makes them eternal, even if their flesh and blood counterparts struggled with debt and irrelevance. The oddities of this transformation are almost humorous. In some manuscripts, illustrators who had never seen battle drew knights in armor, so impractical it looked like fantasy costumes, helmets with exaggerated horns, shields too big to lift, lances longer than cathedral spires. You chuckle, picturing yourself trying to ride into combat with such absurd equipment, falling flat before even reaching the enemy. Yet these mistakes mattered little. The audience wasn't looking for accuracy. They wanted ideals, stories, images to comfort and inspire. The sensory experience of these legends is lush. Picture the deep blue and gold threads of a tapestry, the wool ruff beneath your fingertips as knights hunt unicorns or duel giants. Hear the quiet scratch of a quill as a monk copies another tale of Arthur, ink smelling sharp, parchment stiff. Smell fresh paint in a noble hall as murals of jousts and battles cover the walls, brighter than the reality ever was. Even in silence, you feel surrounded by echoes of knightly glory. Modern scholars disagree about the meaning of this cultural obsession. Some argue it represented nostalgia, a society already aware that knights were fading, clinging to them in art because reality no longer matched. Others see it as deliberate propaganda, keeping the symbol alive for political purposes, ensuring kings could still cloak themselves in chivalric ideals, even as gunpowder dominated war. You suspect both are right. Knights in flesh may stumble, but knights in story never falter. Literature in particular kept the dream alive. Arthurian romances were recopied and retold across Europe, sometimes with new flourishes, sometimes transformed to match contemporary politics. In Spain, tales of Amadís de Gaula inspired generations, filled with impossible quests and perfect knights. You imagine sitting by a hearth while a scribe reads aloud, children wide-eyed, adults sighing wistfully. The words wrap around you like a cloak, letting you believe for just an evening that the world is still filled with dragons to slay and damsels to rescue. And there is humour hidden here too. Not all portrayals were flattering. In Chaucer's tales, the knight is dignified, but his son, the squire, is mocked for vanity and inexperience. Later plays lampooned bumbling knights who lost their way, forgetting oaths while chasing ale or women. You picture yourself wincing as an audience roars with laughter, recognizing the exaggeration but still feeling the sting of satire. The preservation of knightly imagery extended beyond art into ritual. Orders of chivalry, such as the Order of the Garter in England or the Order of the Golden Fleece in Burgundy, wrapped themselves in knightly symbolism long after knights had ceased to dominate war. Robes glittered with embroidery, collars jingled with golden insignia, and ceremonies echoed with vows. You imagine kneeling once again, not in a muddy battlefield or a smoky chapel, but in a candle-lit chamber where courtiers whisper and record every gesture. You feel less a warrior now, more an actor in a living legend. For ordinary people, these symbols still held weight. A villager might never meet a real knight, but he saw them in church glass, heard of them in songs, and believed in them as protectors, even if the reality was far removed. Children still waved sticks as lances, still shouted names like Lancelot, still believed one day a shining figure might ride down their dusty road. The dream had become self-sustaining, feeding on imagination. And so, you find yourself transformed into two beings. One, the weary man of flesh, aching from debt and bruises, uncertain of the future. The other, the immortal knight of art and story, polished to perfection, riding eternally across painted fields and gilded manuscripts. Which one is truer? You cannot say. Both exist, one fading, one eternal. That is the power of memory and legend, to preserve what reality lets slip, to shine brighter as the world grows darker, to make knights immortal even as their armor rusts. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, you feel the glow of candlelit manuscripts, the shimmer of stained glass, the murmur of minstrels. You see yourself not as you are, but as the stories insist you must be, and for once you let the dream carry you whole. The painted knights in stained glass still shimmer in your mind when you wake to the final realization. The title you bear is no longer forged in fire or tested in war. It has become an honor conferred at royal whim, velvet instead of chainmail, ceremony instead of combat. Knighthood, once a hard-won prize earned by bruises and blood, drifts into a new role as a badge of prestige, bestowed on courtiers, poets, and administrators who may never have gripped a lance in earnest. One undeniable reality is that by the 16th century, monarchs across Europe used knighthood as a tool of reward and patronage. In England, the monarch might knight loyal servants, scholars, or explorers. In Spain, the honor tied into orders of chivalry, their robes embroidered with gold instead of soaked in mud. You imagine yourself kneeling in a palace hall while a king gently touches a sword to your shoulder, the moment more pageant than passage, the blade more symbol than weapon. And yet, the oddities of this late knighthood are striking. Some men were knighted on their deathbeds, too frail to even lift a sword. Others received the accolade for little more than attending royal ceremonies. There are records of men ducking the honor, unwilling to pay the hefty fees that sometimes accompanied the title. Yes, being dubbed a knight could actually leave you poorer. You picture yourself muttering under your breath as the treasurer hands you the bill for the honor just laid across your shoulders. The sensory world of these ceremonies is almost unrecognizable from the battlefields of your youth. No sweat, no mud, no acrid smoke of powder. Instead, velvet cushions, embroidered banners, the scent of incense or polished wood floors. Trumpets still sound, but their notes are softer, meant to impress courtiers rather than terrify enemies. The sword tapping your shoulder feels light, almost weightless compared to the heavy lance of old. Historians debate how to interpret this shift. Some argue that late knighthood was hollow, a faded relic of a bygone age. Others see it as adaptation, proof that the institution could survive by evolving into honorific recognition rather than battlefield necessity. You feel both truths stir uneasily inside you. Pride that the name still survives, sorrow that its substance has changed beyond recognition. The human comedy lingers here as well. Imagine poets trying not to trip over their robes as they are knighted, explorers bowing clumsily while still smelling of sea brine, courtiers smirking at one another as if wondering who truly deserved the honor. For all its pomp, knighthood had become accessible to men whose battles were fought with ink, maps, or money. You sigh, both amused and saddened, knowing that the brothers of your youth, those bruised squires and battered riders, would hardly recognize themselves in this gilded company. And yet, the persistence of the title speaks to something enduring. Knights might no longer storm castles, but the word still stirred awe. To be Sir carried weight, dignity, and a whisper of all the centuries that had come before. You imagine yourself signing your name with that honorific, the letters curling like banners, reminding the world that you stand in a line, stretching back to muddy fields, smoky chapels, crimson crosses sewn onto tunics. For ordinary people, the knight remained a beacon. Farmers told children bedtime tales of St. George, of Roland, of Arthur's champions. Songs of knights still drifted through taverns, their verses now more nostalgic than realistic. Even as merchants outshone you, even as cannons shattered your role, even as poets stole your title, the figure of the knight still gleamed in imagination. And perhaps, in the end, that mattered most. So you lie back tonight, no longer on straw but perhaps on feather cushions, the clatter of spurs replaced by the rustle of silk. You breathe in the scent of polished wood, hear the quiet hum of a courtier's lute, and realize that knighthood has shifted, not vanished. It has become legend, ceremony, memory. That is the legacy of the knight. A story too strong to die, reshaped by centuries, carried in rituals, preserved in songs, glowing in stained glass long after the last lance splintered. Now, as the long journey closes, let your mind slow with the fading of hoofbeats. You've walked the full path from page to squire, from bruises in practice yards to the thunder of tournaments, from vows whispered in chapels to the thunder of cannons that shattered old certainties. You've felt the weight of armor and the weight of expectations, tasted feasts and dust, heard laughter and prayers. You've seen knights rise from noble birth, from battlefields, even from the humblest of origins. You've seen women slip into armor against all odds, and merchants eclipse lords in power. You've stood on distant shores under the blinding sun of crusades, and you've sat in courts where knighthood was no longer fought for, but granted like a medal. And now, lying here in the hush of the present moment, you let all those centuries drift together. The clang of steel grows softer, the chants of monks blur into lullabies, the cries of merchants fade into a gentle murmur. Even cannon fire, once deafening, becomes a low rumble like distant thunder. The painted knights of stained glass watch over you silently, their colors glowing in memory. You remind yourself, the legacy of knighthood is not gone. It lingers in the language we use, in the ideals of loyalty and courage, in the quiet wish to protect and to honor. Those dreams are not locked in castles or buried in battlefields. They live in stories, in imaginations, and perhaps faintly in you as you breathe. So let your eyes grow heavy. Let the banners of memory furl. The hooves of time grow distant. The swords slip gently from your hand. You are safe now. You are at rest. Sleep carries you onward, softly, slowly, into dreams where nights still ride.